Prologue. Call me by your name. Out of the ground the Lord God formed every beast of the field and every bird of the sky, and brought them to the man to see what he would call them, and whatever the man called a living creature, that was its name. Genesis 2:19. My parents named me Susan. It was a popular name in the 1940s through the 1960s. A name identifies you, gives you a sense of who you are and your place in the world. Mine is a baby boomer name, and while there are various shades of Susans, many are white. It's an ordinary name, not exotic or posh like Cordelia or Giselle, but not as plain as Jane. It's a biblical name of Hebrew origin meaning lily, associated with hope and the number 11. The name has several notable forebearers: the 19th century suffragette Susan B. Anthony, the Britain's Got Talent singing phenomenon Susan Boyle, the essayist and critic Susan Sontag, the Academy Award-winning actress Susan Sarandon. Even Queen Elizabeth's first corgi, given to her on her 18th birthday, was named Susan. But there was another Susan, a Hollywood actress famous for playing bold and shameless women in the 1940s and 50s, whose name was Susan Hayward. My mother tells me I was named after her. The name Seidelman also identifies me. Although there are German Zeidelmans, spelled I-E and double N, it's often a Jewish last name. The word Zeideln, the etymology of Seidelman, means to settle down, to create a new life in a before unknown place. And that's what I've spent a lifetime trying to do. So my name has 4 identifying features. I'm a baby boomer, white, Jewish, and have settled in a new place. Last year I turned 70, and after spending 40 years on the less glamorous side of the camera telling other people's stories, I've decided to tell my own. This is not a memoir about extraordinary ambition or enormous drive leading to success. Yes, I had ambition and drive, but really what I had was a vision about the kind of movies I wanted to make and the stamina to make them. This is a story about persistence, about putting one foot in front of the other, heading down a path, and after several wrong turns, eventually ending up where I wanted to go. It's also a tale of transformation, one I've played out in real life as well as on film. History likes to mythologize artists as struggling and tortured souls who rise above their circumstances. There's nothing dramatic about growing up normal and relatively happy in a middle-class suburb outside of Philadelphia. When I was young, I thought that having such a boring origin story disqualified me from being a real artist, so at times I created my own chaos just to shake things up. But here's the question. Can you be ordinary and still have something extraordinary to say? Jonathan, my partner of 37 years, most of them good, tells me memoirs need to involve death, drugs, war, dysfunctional parents, sexual abuse, or mental illness. Is he right? And then comes the self-doubt. Shit, that's the way it works. Damn it! He's planted that seed of uncertainty in my head, and it begins to take root. I mean, what have I got to say that would be of interest to anyone other than my mother, who loves everything her kids and grandkids create, including those kindergarten popsicle stick paintings and macaroni collages? Will this embarrass my son? Do I have any life lessons worth sharing? Long pause here to contemplate, then... Fuck yeah! Act 1. Season of the Witch, Donovan. When I look in my window, so many different people to be. Like other people living in quarantine during the pandemic, I spent far too much time online Googling people I knew, reading social media, and, admittedly, yes, embarrassingly, Googling myself. Since my daily life had become so isolated, I hoped I was having more fun in cyberspace. Many of the online posts were connected to Madonna or Sex and the City and its reboot. I was featured in articles about women directors of the 1980s and blogs about the New York indie film scene. Revivals of my movies were still playing in repertory cinemas, and there were reviews of my films that were now streaming on cable. It was therefore a surprise when, in one of my bored and narcissistic check-ins, I found the following question posted under my Wikipedia page. Whatever happened to Susan Seidelman? Women don't age well in the film business, neither in front of nor behind the camera. Had I been invisible for too long? Had I been erased? My first film, Smithereens, was made 40 years ago, and I haven't directed a new movie in a decade. Girls of my generation were brought up to be humble. I have no delusions of grandeur, but no false modesty either. I've played my part in the earlier wave of trailblazers who paved the way for the women directors of today. I've broken barriers, too. In the early 1980s, I directed the first American independent film to officially compete in the Cannes Film Festival. A few years later, I made one of the first Hollywood hits that was directed, produced, written by, and starred women. I cast Meryl Streep in her first movie comedy, then fast forward a decade, and there I am directing the pilot for an HBO series about a group of 30-something gal pals dealing with life and sex in the city, a show I had no idea would become iconic. And I've managed to maintain an aesthetic playfulness and outsider perspective for the past 40 years out of sheer tenacity. I've also had my share of flops and endured the slings and arrows of naysayers. Like others, my life is dotted with woulda, shoulda, couldas, several linked to my gender. Back then, women weren't supposed to make movies, certainly not movies that told stories about women's lives. Thankfully, times have changed, and it's no longer strange to see a woman's name on the directed by credit of a movie or TV series. It's true, more change is needed, but there's no denying that the world is different now. But in 1980, with a few rare exceptions, it was nearly impossible to become a professional film director if you were female, especially not in a studio system that was still run like an all-boys club. There were others before me, pioneering women who wrote, directed, and produced movies in the silent era. Successful women who had been almost entirely written out of cinema history, like Alice Guy and Lois Weber. Because once movies started to talk in 1927, Wall Street realized that the film business could be big business, and women were systematically shut out. Yet there were still a few, very few, exceptions, such as Dorothy Arzner in the 1930s and 40s, Ida Lupino in the 1950s, and Joan Tewksbury and Elaine May in the 1970s. There were also women making their mark in Europe. Agnes Varda and Chantal Akerman in France, Lena Wertmüller in Italy, and Margareta von Trotta in Germany. And of course, there were a few women who made one beautiful movie, then quietly disappeared for reasons unknown. But I wanted a career, one that would last for decades. Making movies was not a hobby or a vanity diversion. I had no fallback position. It was my passion, but it was also my job. Occupation, film director. This is what has paid the bills. There's a kind of self-absorption that comes with getting older. A lot of navel-gazing at a time in your life when you do less and think about more. So, this is a collection of musings and memories about what it was like in the movie industry at a time when there were fewer than a handful of us women, back when girl boss wasn't a term and social media wasn't a thing. Trust me, I have no intention of trash-talking anyone. I love Hollywood. I love the indie film community in New York. I treasure the land of make-believe and the creative people who live there. Even the sharks and schemers have taken on a warm and fuzzy glow with the passage of time. I feel privileged to have been a part of this industry for many years. This is a story about people whose lives intersected with mine. Family, friends, artists, colleagues, some famous, some not, a mix of what I remember as seen through the lens of how I've chosen to remember it. And if how one sees the world is a reflection of who they are, and I believe it is, then you can look at the world reflected in any of my films and see little pieces of me. Like Where's Waldo, I'm hidden somewhere in each of them. Memory plays tricks over time, but it doesn't totally gloss over the truth, although it might put a soft filter on some of life's wrinkles. Wake Up Little Susie, Everly Brothers. A part of me will always be a Philly girl, even though I lived for 43 years in New York City. Philly girls are tough. This story begins in northeast Philadelphia in a working-class part of town called Oxford Circle. This was before my father made enough money to move us all to the suburbs. I was born in a semi-detached house on Kerper Street, in a neighborhood where Jewish newlyweds bought their first homes in the early 1950s for about $5,000. The streets were filled with young mothers pushing baby strollers while their husbands worked as clerks at shoe stores, managers of small furniture shops, and, like my dad, salesmen in their father-in-law's hardware stores. My mother got married at 18, shortly after high school. My father was 20. My maternal grandmother liked my father because he was generous, ambitious, and dependable. She encouraged my mother to get married quickly before he got snatched up by someone else. Although she was shy and studious in high school, my mom blossomed once she got married. My dad adored her, which gave her confidence. She was fun-loving and always saw the bright side of everything. My mother had no particular interest in housekeeping or cooking. Years later, after my father passed away at 81, she confided to me they had a good sex life for their entire marriage. A year and a half after my parents wed, I was born. They were probably too young to have kids, but people grew up faster back then. They would figure it out as they went along. They bought a small house in a neighborhood where there were several other little girls named Susan and Debbie, and there were a shitload of Barbaras. Little boys wearing cowboy hats and shooting cap guns played in tiny backyards, while their sisters fed baby bottles to Betsy Wetsy dolls and changed dolly diapers. Let me start with some basics. I am petite, diminutive. The fact is I'm short. I mention this because my size has defined me for much of my life. No, let me clarify. Others have tried to define me by my size, since it's probably the first thing about me you notice. I'm 4 feet 11 and 1/2 inches tall, but I round up to 5 feet on my driver's license. I've seen the look of surprise on the faces of Hollywood executives when I first enter a room. "She's the film director?" they say with a sideways glance. And they're right. I look nothing like you'd imagine a film director to look. But over the years, I've learned to use my height to my advantage. Here's the rub. I've also had to work 5 times harder and be 10 times as tenacious to be taken seriously in a world that believes bigger is better. I'm the only short member of my immediate family, although my grandparents on both sides were small. I inherited their short genes. There were times I tried to guilt my mother into believing my small stature resulted from being deprived of genuine food as a child. And that part is true. In the 1950s, my thoroughly modern mother refused to be tied to the kitchen stove, so it wasn't until high school that I realized vegetables weren't cubed, soggy things from a can. At home, we ate 3-course meals covered in tinfoil and served in a Swanson's TV dinner tray. Pasta was Chef Boyardee. Fruit came in a can labeled Del Monte. Although, as times changed, my mother did experiment with a few homemade recipes. They all involved Campbell's soup. Mishmash. Take 1 can of Campbell's minestrone soup. Add 1 pound of ground meat and salt, pepper, and ketchup to taste. Heat, then serve over Uncle Ben's instant rice. This was my mom's signature dish. When I was young, I was verbal, outgoing, and self-assured. My mother told me I was cute. Of course, that was a decade before she called me a disobedient teenage tramp. I was going to write ha-ha, but at the time it wasn't funny. Recently, I came across a school photo of my kindergarten class taken in 1957. There I am, front and center, because on photo day, the students were arranged in size order, starting from first row center. I'm dressed in a Little Red Riding Hood cape. I'm not sure what my mother was thinking that morning. My legs are carelessly spread apart. My feet, in little white socks and Mary Janes, barely touch the floor. My cape is full and draped across the lap of the timid little boy in a bow tie sitting next to me. I have long dark hair pulled back into a ponytail, a fringe of bangs cut straight above my eyebrows. My smile is filled with confidence. There were several advantages to being petite. At age 3, I was selected to perform on the Horn and Hardart Children's Hour, a local televised kids' talent show, and scheduled to sing the Teapot song. I'm a little teapot, short and stout. Here is my handle, here is my spout. I practiced performing it with elaborately choreographed hand and body gestures, coached by my mother. Unfortunately, I came down with chickenpox the morning of my TV debut, so I never made it onto the show. Being pint-sized was also fun. My older cousins and uncles picked me up and tossed me high into the air like a beach ball. It was only when I got older that I found out being small can be a liability in an industry where size matters. The size of your weekend box office, the size of your production deal, the size of your house, the size of your fill in the blank. At age 8, I would play Thumbelina in a summer camp musical based on the Hans Christian Andersen fairy tale. Although I had limited singing ability, I was the only camper who fit into the costume and could remember the lines. I got to twirl around on stage while everyone sang about precious little Thumbelina. But it didn't take long before I realized that I actually didn't like being center stage. I preferred staying behind the scenes, where I could organize, create, and boss other people around. What I really wanted to do was direct. Somewhere Over the Rainbow, Judy Garland. 25 years later, I find myself standing on another stage. Actually, it's a stage on a movie set. There's 50 crew members, mostly men, busy at work all around me. 2 actresses are there as well, and a crowd of movie extras. Both actresses are pretty and blonde, about the same age, 27, 28. And they look somewhat similar height, similar build, a harder and softer reflection of each other. It's our 7th week of filming, and we're shooting a scene in a dilapidated building once known as the Audubon Ballroom on West 165th Street. It's where Malcolm X was assassinated in 1965 while giving a speech. We've turned the crumbling ballroom into a funky, punk retro nightclub with a showcase of oddball entertainers. There's a neon sign out front that blinks Magic Club. Inside, there's a magician wearing a cape and a turban, a ventriloquist and his dummy, a comedian in a shabby tuxedo who tells corny jokes, and a house band of geriatric musicians. Just the kind of club I like. Everyone looks like background extras who stepped out of Woody Allen's Broadway Danny Rose. Today, there's a new electrician working on set. It's his first day on the job, and it's apparent he knows nothing about the film or its participants. He sees me standing off to the side, watching as the grips and gaffers adjust lighting and assemble a dolly track. He walks over and asks me to bring him a bottle of water, assuming I'm a production assistant and it's my job to look after the crew. I look like I could be one, since it's 1984, and that's the job most of the women on set have. I say nothing, but go over to the nearby craft service table and return with a bottle of water. I hand it to him. I don't remember if he thanks me. Maybe he did. I smile to myself, but can't wait to see the look on his face when he finds out that I'm the director and could easily have him fired. I look nothing like what he'd expect a director to look like. I'm young, girlish, and I don't wear a reverse baseball cap or have a scruffy beard. Unfortunately, I won't get to see his reaction when my identity is revealed, because he's now disappeared into the shadows, and I'm too busy rehearsing with the actors to look around for him. Madonna enters the Magic Club wearing a sexy black sequined jacket and the black mesh rhinestone boots that will one day be collectible. She takes a seat near the stage. She's playing a character named Susan, who has come to watch the magic show. In real life, her music career is skyrocketing, but no one could imagine the superstar she will become and remain for the next 4 decades, turning feminism inside out along the way. Rosanna Arquette is on stage, dressed in a pink tutu and a blonde wig. She's playing a magician's assistant and is about to climb into a casket-like box and get sawed in half. She, too, plays a character who thinks her name is Susan. I wish I could have told her then what I know now, that this would probably be the most memorable role of her film career. But I didn't know that at the time. The cinematographer, Ed, comes over and tells me the lights are set and we are ready for a take. The first assistant director, Joel, calls out, "Quiet on set!" The sound rolls, the camera rolls, the clapboard is clapped. I shout, "Action!" But I'm jumping ahead of myself. So before you get confused, let's rewind to 1959, where I'm still a 7-year-old, impatient to grow up. You don't own me. Leslie Gore. I was a restless kid. I could concentrate when something grabbed my attention, but some part of my body was always in motion. My parents told me I had ants in my pants, the heebie-jeebies. My grandmother called it spilkus. As a teenager, I was nicknamed the Energizer Bunny and Roadrunner. I was always doing 3 things at once. Today, it's called multitasking, and it's a skill that comes in handy if you ever want to direct a movie. My favorite retort as a child was to put my hands on my hips and say, "You're not the boss of me," which usually got me a spanking or my mouth washed out with soap. Corporal punishment was not yet frowned upon in the late 1950s, and although my parents were loving and affectionate, my father was not averse to taking off his belt and chasing my younger sister and me around the dining room table. Girls were not supposed to be assertive or bossy. But that too comes in handy as a director, just add a smile. Back in the 1950s and 60s, children were more independent than they are today. By the age of 7, I was walking 8 blocks to school alone, crossing double lanes of traffic, my ponytail swinging. My mother never thought it was dangerous to let her little girl walk alone down city streets. She knew there were bad people in the world, but not in our world. She had always felt safe. So did I. Plus, I was now a big sister, which made me feel self-sufficient and grown up. My younger sister, Denise, called Zisi, was born 2.5 years after me, followed by Richie, the bird baby, in 1957. For my father, having a baby boy was like winning the lottery, and my parents sent out birth announcements. The king has arrived. It was decided from birth that the bird baby was going to be a doctor, and that is exactly what he became. I discovered my vagina one day while watching the Mickey Mouse Club. I was lying on the carpet, staring at the small black and white console television in our living room. I was probably 5 or 6 at the time, and fascinated by Perky, Annette Funicello, and Tommy, the cute boy Mouseketeer. Distractedly, my hand wandered down to my private parts, and I discovered something pleasurable there. My mother walked into the room, saw whatever it was I was doing, and scolded, "Susan, don't touch your pussy." I quickly moved my hand away. I didn't know what I'd done wrong. I just knew it felt good, but now I knew it was forbidden. The word tussie may be derived from the Yiddish word tuchis in combination with the English word pussy. I was learning that some things that bring you pleasure are best kept secret. I had 2 grandmothers, Nana H. and Nanny S. One cooked, the other didn't. Nana H. was my mother's mother, a pretty but nervous woman who stood about 4 feet 11 inches. She was always proud of her good posture and would push back my shoulders and tell me to stand up straight. Her short genes skipped my mother and was passed down to me. At night, she kept her false teeth in a glass of water on her bedside table. She was probably only 50 at the time, but people aged differently back then. Everyone looked old by 40. Nana H. pretended to enjoy cooking, but she really thought of it as a chore, like sex, that a wife was obligated to perform for her husband. Over the years, she perfected the art of boiling the flavor out of everything. This was a skill that would be passed down from mother to daughter for the next 3 generations. Nanny S., my father's mother, was an excellent cook. She made a fantastic lemon custard poppy seed cake that still makes my mouth water. She wore a poofy blonde wig she kept on a wig stand on her dressing table. Actually, she had 2 wigs, her daytime wig and her special occasion wig, the one she saved for weddings and bar mitzvahs. My father's side of the family were colorful storytellers, especially if the stories involved growing up during the Depression in West Philadelphia in a noisy house filled with unmarried aunts and unemployed uncles. All my relatives were supported by my sweet-natured grandfather, Harry. My father shared a bed with Uncle Aki, sleeping head to toe. There were also my great aunts, Udi and Tootie. Udi was the family beauty. She had been engaged many times but never married, and never gave back any of her engagement rings. Years later, when my father's sister, Aunt Phyllis, began to suffer from dementia, she told me that Udi was a prostitute, but I'll never know if that was true. I was probably only 6 the last time I saw Turi, and mostly what I remember was that she was a heavy-set woman who would always say, "I could eat you all up." And I believed she could. Turi had whiskers. Not obvious ones you could see, but you could feel little stubbly pricks on your cheek when she gave you a big wet kiss. There's a strong, stubborn streak that runs through all the Seidelman women on my father's side. A tell-it-like-it-is outspokenness that can sometimes seem blunt, but is never intentionally mean-spirited. This would be passed on to me. My mother's side were more concerned with manners and appearances, but under the surface they were tightly wound, and a few suffered from depression. Except for my mom, who is genuinely the most enthusiastic person I know. She can turn picking up the dry cleaning into an exciting adventure. My mother hit the jackpot when they handed out the happy gene. We are family. Sister Sledge. When I was 10, my family moved to a new middle-class suburban development just outside of Philadelphia, in a town called Huntingdon Valley. It was 1962, and my father's business, a family-owned hardware company, was booming due to the growing market for affordable housing and the popularity of aluminum siding. More Americans were becoming homeowners and needed reasonably priced hardware, so my dad and my uncle Arnold built a small factory in an industrial park outside of Center City, Philadelphia. They now had well over 100 employees. All of my father's childhood dreams had come true. He had a loving wife, 3 healthy kids, a custom-built colonial house, and a Cadillac parked out front. The first night in our new house, the entire family piled into the big walk-in shower together. My father had the letter S for Seidelman etched in fancy script on the glass shower door. All 5 of us, in bathing suits, stood inside, shampooing our hair at the same time. It was a big change from the small bathtub with the plastic shower curtain we had before. A clear sign that we had moved up a rung on the social ladder. It felt like we were rich. Our suburban development had the mellifluous name June Meadows and was a storybook version of the American dream, an instant neighborhood that had popped up almost overnight, built on what was once farmland. Nearby was a new shopping center, a large parking lot surrounding a row of single-story shops with a roof to protect shoppers from inclement weather and a built-in sound system that played music. A supermarket anchored one end and a bowling alley the other. It was our suburban version of Main Street, USA. There were basically 3 styles of houses to choose from: the ranch, the split level, and the colonial. My father bought an oversized 2-acre lot at the end of a cul-de-sac. Here, he built our custom colonial with white pillars and a circular drive. In the center of the lawn were 2 large metal lawn sculptures, each about 6 feet tall. A king and a queen that looked like enormous chess pieces. Potted flowers grew from the crowns on top of their heads. This house would be our castle, so I guess that made my sister and me the princesses, my brother the prince. My parents could have afforded one of the older Tudor-style homes in a nearby fancy area called Rydal. These were elegant stone and stucco houses built in the 1920s, with creeping ivy, sweeping drives, and stone terraces. This is where the doctors and lawyers lived. But my dad always liked being a big fish in a small pond, so we had the biggest house in the less upscale but spanking new development of June Meadows. The suburbs were not just a place. They were a state of mind. Living there whittled the complexities of life down to a manageable size. It was like living in a protective bubble. Looked at from the outside, it had many advantages. It was safe, clean, and well-organized. But it had disadvantages, too. It was a homogeneous world, inhabited mostly by people who wanted to live among people like us. It provided a safety net that could also feel like a noose. In 4th grade, I transferred to a suburban elementary school, where I was now the new kid. Although I was bright and outgoing, my 4th grade teacher, Mrs. Kirschbaum, didn't like me. This was upsetting because I'd been popular with teachers in the past, but Mrs. Kirschbaum didn't like the way I would slip off my capezios and twirl them around with my toes under my desk. By the end of class, one shoe had landed under the desk 3 rows in front of me, the other 3 rows behind. Mrs. Kirschbaum thought I was twirling my shoes for attention. I knew it was nervous tension about being the new kid, combined with boredom. As punishment, Mrs. K made me stand out in the hallway by my locker. Mostly you'd find boys standing in the hallway, but every once in a while there would be a girl, me. Back then, test papers were handwritten by teachers onto a stencil. Then copies were run off using a manual mimeograph machine located in the school's supply room. I would readily volunteer to help crank out the copies and bring them back to class, hot off the press. Mrs. Kirschbaum saw this as an activity to keep me busy, wear me out. I saw it as a treat. I loved inhaling the dizzying smell of the deep purple ink on my fingers as I walked the fresh copies back to the classroom. Every once in a while, I still catch a whiff of that scent, and it instantly takes me back to my childhood. Xerox photocopy machines would soon replace the mimeograph machine and kill all the fun. Despite my love for books and stories, Mrs. K put me in the low reading group with the dumb kids. There were 3 reading groups, tactlessly named the high, the medium, and the low. You'd think an elementary school teacher could come up with more creative names to make the ranking less obvious. Maybe something cute like the sparrows, the robins, and the hummingbirds. But Mrs. Kirschbaum was a nasty and sadistic bitch who enjoyed traumatizing her students. She would be my bête noire my entire life, even after I'd achieved some level of success. The low group was told to bring their chairs up to the front of the room, where we formed a circle and took turns reading aloud. All the other kids would stare at us, the dummies, which added to my anxiety. When it was my turn to read, my voice would stammer, and I developed a fear of public speaking that would continue well into adulthood. Years later, when my film career took off and I was invited to speak at film festivals or do radio and television interviews, I would flash back to Mrs. Kirschbaum. I hoped she was still alive and saw me on TV. I desperately wanted to prove I was no dummy. As a kid, I thought my mother was like Lucille Ball. Not the real Lucille Ball, but the character she played on TV. And like Ricky Ricardo, the TV version, my father worshipped her. They argued, at times animatedly, but there was never any ugliness in their squabbles. Usually it was about some silly household repair or interior decoration. It was a loud house, filled with commotion, filled with life. But at times the noise could get overwhelming, and I would retreat to my bedroom to escape and go somewhere else in my head. My dad had flashy taste. He had grown up poor during the Depression, and as a young boy went to school wearing his sister's girly hand-me-down coats. He quit high school in 11th grade, too impatient to graduate and eager to get out into the world and make his mark. So when he started to make money, he enjoyed showing off the things he'd been denied as a child. My dad was a hard worker and a straight shooter who never forgot where he came from. To outsiders, he might have appeared gruff. My friends were afraid of him. But inside, he was a teddy bear and a fiercely loyal family man. On Sunday afternoons, we would go out for long family drives in my dad's big-finned caddy. Now, take a moment to imagine what the car must have smelled like. My dad would be puffing on a cool menthol with the windows rolled up. He didn't like his brill-creamed hair blowing in the wind, and the air conditioning on high. His face was splashed with Old Spice aftershave. My mom smelled like a mix of Aquanet and Fabergé Tigress. Now, add in the scent of new leather car seats. This was the smell of my childhood. And here's the soundtrack. The car radio blasting pop songs from Chubby Checker, Dion, Ray Charles, and my own personal favorite, The Locomotion by Little Eva. 3 kids squabbling in the backseat, no seatbelts. We went flying whenever my father hit the brakes, then all laughed. It was the summer of 1962, a time of prosperity and peace. President Kennedy was in the White House, and the world was perfect. My dad also had a Borscht Belt sense of humor. He loved jokes about shitting, farting, and belching. I confess I'm still a sucker for a good fart joke. Question: why is love like a fart? Answer: if you have to force it, it's probably crap. My father would laugh so hard that tears would stream down his cheeks. He was also very affectionate, a big, noisy kisser. When he gave you a kiss, he would suck in your whole cheek. Once, my dad gave my sister, Denise, a kiss on her neck that resulted in a purple hickey. It involved nothing inappropriate, and we all thought it was funny at the time. But my sister went to school the next day with that big purple hickey, and my mother had to call the principal to explain. Innocent Denise, the middle child, who would grow up to become a successful attorney, the most stubborn and argumentative of us all. For a short period of time, Denise and I took piano lessons from a teacher who went by the name of Professor Marquez. Whether he was an actual professor or not was never questioned. He would come to our house once a week in the evening, and we would sit next to him on the piano bench, often in our pajamas and bathrobes, and do keyboard exercises. Sometimes he put our small hands on top of his to follow along with whatever he was playing. But at one point he got a little touchy-feely with 8-year-old Denise, resting his hand on her thigh. My sister, not fully aware of what was going on but sensing it was creepy, casually mentioned this to our mother, and the professor was abruptly fired. But it was 1963, and people kept quiet, so his inappropriate behavior was never reported to the police. However, that was the end of our formal music education. Although I never learned to read sheet music, my fingers had been trained by rote to play the opening few bars of Rachmaninoff's Prelude in C-sharp minor and Beethoven's Für Elise, which I continued to play on autopilot for the next 20 years. Glory Days, Bruce Springsteen. I had the random good fortune to be born into a cheerful family, a lucky roll of the genetic dice. My mother had married an adoring man who protected her and gave her a comfortable lifestyle, family Christmas trips to the Caribbean, summers at the Jersey Shore, department store credit cards, and the resources to redecorate the house every few years, which she did, just to keep busy and express herself artistically. The living room in our home was spacious, with velvet flock wallpaper and a never-used white marble fireplace. In fact, the entire room was unused and pristine, thankfully without the plastic slipcovers that covered Nana H's good furniture. We only walked into the living room once or twice a year, and never for long. When my parents' friends came over, they would head down to the den, where my dad had built a long wood-paneled bar with mirrored shelves and 6 bar stools. My father wasn't a drinker, so all the alcohol on the shelves were the sweet liqueurs you could pour over vanilla ice cream and turn into dessert. Kahlua, amaretto, creme de menthe, and, later, Bailey's Irish Cream. It made me feel grown up to sit at the bar, eating my Swanson's TV dinner, Salisbury steak, mashed potatoes, and apple cobbler. To this day, I still like eating at bars. The den was where my parents entertained their friends before they headed out for their date nights. My parents would dress up every Saturday evening and go to a restaurant in Center City or a popular nightclub in Cherry Hill, New Jersey called the Latin Casino, which wasn't Latin, nor was it a casino. It was a large Vegas-style dinner theater that brought in top acts like Johnny Mathis, Brenda Lee, Tony Bennett, and Frankie Valli and the Four Seasons. Women wore cocktail dresses and men wore dinner jackets to attend the shows, but unlike Vegas, it was family-friendly, so you could bring along Granny and the kids to the early shows. Around this time, my parents became friendly with a couple named Bunny and Norman. Norman was a business associate of my father's, and Bunny looked like a movie star. She wore her blonde hair up in a French twist, like Tippi Hedren. Bunny and Norman didn't have children, which was pretty unusual for a married couple at that time. All my parents' other friends had 2 or 3. Instead, Bunny and Norman had dogs. Poodles. On the few occasions Bunny stopped by in the afternoon to visit, I remember her wearing capri pants and bringing along a young male companion. He was her hairdresser. I thought he dressed in a dapper European style, very different from my father and our suburban neighbors. This was my first glimpse of people living lives distinctly different from our own. It wasn't that Bunny was an important figure in my life. I hardly knew her. But she made an impression. She was glamorous and unique, and that's probably why, after all these years, I remember her, her poodles, her capri pants, her French twist, and her hairdresser. Bunny died mysteriously a few years later from a gunshot wound to the head. It was rumored that there had been foul play, and Norman was involved. But I'll never know the truth. Norman disappeared from our lives shortly thereafter. My final reminder of Bunny was our family dog, bought from a breeder she had recommended. It was a champagne-colored poodle named Chi-Chi. Unfortunately, Chi-Chi had a high-strung, miserable disposition and would often hide under the bed growling. She did not like being tormented by 3 boisterous children. She would have much preferred strolling down the Champs-Élysées in Paris to roaming the asphalt cul-de-sac of June Meadows. One day, Chi-Chi ran out of the house and was hit by a delivery truck. Chi-Chi, like Bunny, was suddenly gone. The next week, we got a golden cocker spaniel named Corky, who had a much sweeter temperament and more tolerance toward both suburban life and kids. For a while, we had a mother's helper who slept over at the house on Saturday nights when my parents went on their date nights. Her name was Margie. She was a black teenager of about 15. She lived in North Philadelphia, the rough part of town. Her aunt was a housekeeper for someone in our neighborhood. Margie was the first person who talked to me about sex. We would sit up for hours after my sister and brother had gone to bed, and she would tell me fascinating stories about her escapades with her boyfriend. They were sexy and romantic. She taught me the words jizz and blowjob. I had never heard of fellatio before, and found the concept strange and exciting at the same time. But I was confused about why anyone would put their mouth on the thing a boy peed out of. Of course, I had to tell my girlfriends all about our conversations the following Monday. This would be a PG-13 version of a scene I would direct 35 years later in Sex and the City, but instead of gathering at a chic restaurant in Tribeca and drinking Cosmos, we were sitting at a Formica table in the lunchroom of Rydell Elementary School, drinking cartons of milk through paper straws and snorting with laughter until the milk spewed out of our noses. Adolescence was a confusing time. I got my first stretch bra and faked my first period, wanting to be ahead of the curve. Then, a few months later, when I really did bleed, I had to act blasé since I'd already told some friends I'd had it. My girlfriends were the center of my life, and I had several different best friends. They alternated every few months because adolescent girls can be fickle. But at age 12, losing a bestie can be dramatic. Hurt, anger, rejection, almost like a divorce. Did I mention I became superstitious in an attempt to make sense out of the hormonal chaos? I invented a series of magic rituals I performed every night before going to bed. I would open my sliding closet doors exactly 1 fist wide. This way, I would know if any ghosts or evil spirits had entered my closet while I was asleep. I would remeasure the opening in the morning to make sure the gap was still exactly the same size. I'd walk around my room pairing objects and stuffed animals into groups of 2. Everything needed a partner to talk to, in case they came alive in the middle of the night. I believed in magical thinking. I believed that if you thought of something hard enough and visualized it in your mind, you could make it happen. I was obsessed with the number 11, and for years, every time I glanced at my bedside radio alarm clock, the number had just flipped to 1111. This necessitated getting out of bed, no matter how tired, going on my knees, and reciting a prayer of my own invention. I sprinkled in a few Hebrew words I'd picked up at synagogue without knowing their actual meaning, but they sounded holy. Needless to say, going to bed was a long and arduous process. At school, I became friendly with some of the cool Italian kids who had left Catholic school after 6th grade. I was fascinated by Catholicism because it had sacraments, symbols, and fantastical objects. It appealed to my sense of mystery and high drama. The clear-eyed logic of Reform Judaism seemed bland by comparison. Although we weren't religious, we celebrated the major Jewish holidays, like Hanukkah, where I got practical gifts like underwear with the days of the week printed across the backside, pajamas, or a Jean Naté bath set. Most of our family rituals centered around food. Bagels and lox on Sunday mornings, Chinese food on Christmas Eve, all the other local restaurants were closed. And we did a Yom Kippur break fast with white fish salad and kugel. For Passover, we had a big family Seder, read the Haggadah, and asked the 4 questions. Why is this night different? We put out a symbolic glass of wine for the prophet Elijah, but when we opened the front door to welcome the prophet inside, my father would shout, "Enough already, you're letting out the air conditioning." I heard that Italian and French families regularly drank wine with dinner, but the only wine I'd ever tasted was Manischewitz, which, in the 1960s, tasted like cough syrup, sweet and thick. I couldn't imagine why Europeans would want to drink this sickly stuff every night. Doctor My Eyes, Jackson Browne. There was an amusement park not far from our house in Willow Grove Park. It had roller coasters, a funhouse, a tunnel of love, and a big Ferris wheel. My mother would take my sister and me to go on the rides, eat cotton candy, and visit the sideshow. Why my mother took her young daughters to a sideshow is puzzling, but we were all fascinated by life's quirks and peculiarities. The first celebrity autograph I ever got was from Priscilla the Monkey Girl, a bearded lady dressed in a Victorian gown sitting on a makeshift wooden stage. Everything about her, her voice, her gestures, her facial features, was feminine, except for her long beard, mustache, and unibrow. This was the first time I noticed that the line between what was considered masculine and feminine could be ambiguous. I also got an autographed photo from Hank, the armless man, who signed it with his feet. There were a fat lady, a reptile man, a sword swallower, a giant, and a contortionist. I felt immediate empathy with the performers on stage. I'm not sure why, but their otherness made them special to me. I'm sure being a performer in a traveling carnival was a harsh life, but in my mind I had romanticized their itinerant lifestyle. Even at that age, I was itchy to move around. The sideshow existed in Willow Grove until the mid-1960s. In the 1970s, the park was shut down, and by the early 80s, the grounds were turned into a generic shopping mall. Where the sideshow tent once stood, there is now a TGI Fridays. My sister, mother, and I also enjoyed thumbing through art history books with paintings of martyred saints and pictures of the cruel punishments meted out by capricious Greek and Roman gods. When we went to the Philadelphia Art Museum, we headed straight for the Rubens painting Prometheus Bound. It depicted an eagle pecking out the liver of Prometheus, who was bound to a rock. We sat for half an hour mesmerized, discussing all the horrific things the ancient gods did to mortals. We loved Medusa with her head full of snakes. We were riveted by Cronus, who ate his children. We hunted down the painting of Saint Sebastian tied to a tree. We needed to see his bloody body pierced with arrows. But despite her fascination with the macabre, my mother had an upbeat, optimistic disposition that she passed on to her daughters. She was the mom all my friends wanted as their own. She willingly drove the carpool, schlepping us to movies and dance classes. She could be relied upon to throw on a bathrobe in the middle of the night to pick everyone up from a party when the designated driver didn't show. So I'm not sure why, at 14, I felt the need to rebel, or exactly what I was rebelling against. But at some point, I knew that if I wanted the adventurous life I'd fantasized about, I'd have to create it myself. But the pathway there was fuzzy. So was my eyesight. My vision had begun to blur. I'd always suspected I saw the world through a slightly different lens than my friends and family. Now I knew it was true. I was diagnosed with uveitis, an inflammatory condition inside my eye that can be caused by infection, injury, or, in my case, an autoimmune condition of unknown origin. It can cause pain, redness, and blurry vision, and in extreme cases, blindness. I'd been experiencing blurry vision and floaters for a few months and was sent to see several ophthalmologists who confirmed the condition, but had no idea what was causing it. I spent a week at Will's Eye Hospital, where I was poked and probed and punctured. I had a spinal tap and nightly IV drips. The veins in my arms were so bruised, I had to get the drips in my feet. The doctors said the problem was systemic, although they couldn't pinpoint an exact diagnosis, except that my body was attacking itself from within. I don't know how seriously I contemplated the possibility of going blind, but it was obviously on my mind. I'm sure I was terrified, but I've edited most of this chapter out of my memory. Eventually, I was sent home and prescribed weekly shots of cortisone to reduce further inflammation. I remember closing my eyes at night and feeling my way around my bedroom, practicing how I could navigate as a blind girl, like Audrey Hepburn in Wait Until Dark. Over the next few years, my vision gradually improved, although the floaters have stayed with me to this day. But I was determined not to give them the attention they were demanding. I looked at myself in the mirror, put my hands on my hips, and muttered to the uveitis, "I'll show you. You're not the boss of me." Runaround Sue, Dion. Being the oldest of three and only 20 years younger than my mother, I was the one she tested her nascent parenting skills on. Raising an adolescent with a rebellious streak was uncharted territory, a lot of trial and error. Here's one of our 8th grade mother-daughter conversations. Me. Mom, can I shave my legs? Her. No. Me. My legs look like a gorilla. Kids are going to make fun of me. Her. I said no. No means no. Me. Well, can I at least shave under my arms? Her. No. Once you start shaving, you can never stop. It's a vicious cycle. So I would go over to my friend Barbara's house after school. She had one of the few professional working moms, so the house was empty in the afternoon, and I'd shave my legs, put on a pair of tights, then walk home. I didn't like being deceitful or sneaky, but in my mind, my mother had forced me into this untenable position. It was her fault if I was rebellious. Having hairy legs is a burden no 8th grade girl should have to bear. Once I committed to being a sneaky person, I was able to expand that skill to other areas of my life, like slipping my parents' tiny airplane-sized bottles of alcohol into my handbag to take to parties, or sneaking boys into the house when my parents were away. By the time my younger sister turned 12, my mother was feeling more confident about her parenting skills and loosened her grip. Denise had much more freedom and didn't have to skulk around. As a result, she became the most straightforward person I know. And by the time my little brother, Richie, hit puberty in the early 70s, my mother had started college as a full-time student and was busy reinventing herself. Consequently, she didn't notice the marijuana plants growing on Richie's bedroom windowsills. Or maybe she did, but didn't care, since the boundaries of her own world had opened up. Richie told her they were tomato plants, and she encouraged his new interest in horticulture. In high school, I started to call myself Sue. It sounded more casual, more laid back, like a real teenage name. I also tried out Susie with a heart above the I, but Sue sounded cooler. There's a cardboard box I recently found on the top of my closet. Inside were a bunch of old diaries. The kind of adolescent diaries with daisies and red polka dots on the cover that you close with a little lock and key. They were written when I was between the ages of 12 and 14. I used little symbols as code for different secret activities, sort of like primitive emojis. The code was easy to break since I'd written a code guide on the back page of the diary in case I forgot what the symbols meant. 1 star meant I kissed a boy. 2 stars meant with tongues. As I got older, the variety of symbols grew more complicated. 2 suns meant second base. A down arrow meant third. I never had a home run. That would wait until my 4th week of college. For some reason, I named my diary Harriet, perhaps in memory of my grandfather Harry, who had recently passed away. I was also very meticulous about writing down the exact time I finished each entry and signing my full name to the bottom of each page as if it was an official document. Some of the entries were about boys I liked and girls I didn't. They described petty grievances, small injustices, flashes of jealousy, and moments of adolescent insecurity. March 3rd, 1964. Dear Harriet, today I went to Charm and Poise Club after school. I'm going on a diet because I weigh 91 and I want to get down to 85. I talked out in science class, so now I have to write an essay on why I shouldn't interrupt people. Gary S. was talking too, but he didn't get caught. Unfair. Sue Seidelman, 10:31 p.m. October 4th, 1964. Dear Harriet, Wendy had a sleepover Saturday night and I wasn't invited. Wendy's such a bitch. I caught her picking her nose during math. I'm sure that's why she didn't invite me. I thought Ivy was my best friend, but she told Brenda she was her best friend. They better not be talking behind my back. Sue Seidelman, 9:05 p.m. May 17th, 1965. Dear Harriet, went to school and wore a sleeveless shell, which I was kind of embarrassed to wear because of my hairy arms. After school, went to Barbara's house, then to Strawbridge's to buy bell-bottoms. Had a fight with Mom again. Bobby C. came by with his brother and some older kids in a car. 2 stars, 2 suns. Sue Seidelman, 10:56 p.m. November 12th, 1965. Dear Harriet, this morning I broke a mirror, and I've been having good luck all day. Barbara, Ellen, and I went to Cedar Brook Mall and got silver friendship rings. We were all going to get our ears pierced, but Ellen chickened out. Bobby called twice. Sue Seidelman, and it's really him. I was surprised to see how often my diaries mentioned movies, who starred in them, what the actors wore, their hairstyles, the decoration of the rooms. I never thought about the film's director or even knew what a director actually did. I went to whatever movie was playing at the local movie theater without discernment. I just liked escaping into other people's more exciting lives projected up on a big screen. At the time, there was still a large 400-seat theater where you could smoke in the balcony. That was before it got divided into a multiplex in the late 1970s and lost its magic. I also wrote entries about movies I'd watched on late-night TV. My sister, brother, and I huddled together in bed, watching black and white B-movies starring Vincent Price and Christopher Lee, and getting high on our childhood farts. We were night owls and loved staying awake until the Late Late Show ended and the national anthem played, followed by the Indian head test pattern signaling the end of the broadcasting day. Around this time, I developed a fascination with bad boys. Actually, they weren't really bad, but they put on a tough rebel attitude, passed down from their older brothers, probably inspired by James Dean and the young Marlon Brando. Most came from the other side of town, the blue-collar neighborhood near Willow Grove Park, where the houses were smaller and closer together. I also developed an interest in kissing. My hormones were raging, and making out with boys, we called it macking, was a cheap and readily available weekend entertainment. It was also a form of rebellion. Plus, it gave your mouth something fun to do. Every Friday night, there was a make-out party in someone's basement while their parents were out. That's when we invited the bad boys over. Sometimes they arrived drunk. Sometimes they were high from huffing glue, which, at the time, was a cheap buzz. All you needed was a paper bag and a tube of model airplane glue easily bought from Hobbyland. Back then, marijuana was still only smoked by New York City beatniks and jazz musicians, and the methamphetamine and opioid plague wouldn't hit the suburbs until a few decades later. My mother warned me, "We didn't move to Huntington Valley so you could run around with hoodlums. You're going to get a reputation." And she was right. By 9th grade, I had one. There was one boy I liked in particular, Bobby C. He dressed like a smoothie. Smoothies wore cuffed khaki pants, tucked-in Banlin shirts, and desert boots. They were generally bad students, but good dancers and sharp dressers. One night, I invited Bobby C. over to my house, knowing my parents would be out for the evening. He arrived with a group of friends. They traveled in packs. While Bobby and I were making out in the den, his friends were robbing the house and rifling through my mother's handbag. I wasn't aware of this until my parents returned home that night, and my mother found the contents of her bag scattered around the room. The next day, she called Bobby's mother, whom she had never met, and told her about the incident. That evening, Bobby's mother drove him to our house and made him apologize in person to my parents. Mortified, I hid upstairs in my bedroom. Bobby and I broke up right after that. More specifically, he broke up with me, but I was never quite sure about the sequence of events. We just stopped talking. That's the way it was with 8th grade romance. We turned our heads in opposite directions when we passed in the hallway and ignored each other totally. But I was upset and remember locking myself in the bathroom at home, turning on the water full force so my mother wouldn't hear me crying. Melodramatically, I vowed that I would never allow myself to feel this kind of rejection again. I felt used and tossed away like an old tissue. Used and tossed away dialogue borrowed from an old 1950s movie. "I'll show him," I sniffled to my reflection in the mirror above the bathroom sink. "One day, I'll show you all." There's a quote by Graham Greene in his book The Power and the Glory. He writes, "There's always one moment in childhood when the door opens and lets the future in." I didn't have that one big moment. Instead, I had several small moments that merged together to form a big one. My reaction to the breakup with Bobby was one of those moments. Disappointment would fuel my fire. Success would be my revenge. 50 years later, at a high school reunion, I bumped into my old friend Gary, who had kept in touch with Bobby C. over the years. Gary had wanted to be an actor, moved to New York City, but after a few early successes, got cold feet and returned to Philly to become a county judge. He was curious to know how I, a mediocre high school student and the recipient of many does not live up to her potential report cards, ended up becoming a film director. After a few glasses of wine, I told him jokingly about how after being dumped by Bobby C. in 8th grade, I vowed to use my hurt and rejection to prove something to myself and the world. Gary thought the story was funny and asked if he could tell Bobby, who had moved to San Francisco many years earlier and was working as a photographer. I was happy to hear that he had left the neighborhood and was doing something creative, but doubted I would even recognize him if we passed on the street. A week later, Gary called me. He had spoken with Bobby, who said he thought I was the one who had dumped him in 8th grade. I dumped Bobby? How could I have gotten that so wrong? This had been a defining moment in my childhood, my I'll show you moment. All I could think about was how glad I was not to know this at the time, or I might never have made that vow, and my entire life's journey could have been totally different. Dazed and Confused, Led Zeppelin. Here's an example of why I lost my parents' trust in high school. I had been caught shoplifting trinkets from Woolworths with a group of girlfriends. I confess I was the group's ringleader. I knew it was wrong, and I could have easily bought the cheap items I pinched, a tube of pale pink CoverGirl lipstick and a bottle of peacock blue ink for my fountain pen. But I looked at it as a challenge, an adventure, with just enough real-life danger to make it exciting. I had been inspired by a scene in Breakfast at Tiffany's, every teenage girl's favorite movie, where Audrey Hepburn and George Peppard wander through a five-and-dime store looking for some small thing to pilfer, then run out laughing wearing stolen Halloween masks. They didn't get caught, but I did. My mother made me return the items to Woolworths and apologize for my criminal behavior to the pimply teenage girl snapping gum behind the cash register. And of course, the stolen car incident was a total misunderstanding. What happened was, we were on summer vacation and staying at a motel in Margate City, a seaside town outside of Atlantic City. My mother allowed me to bring along my friend Debbie. It was the 4th of July weekend, and we heard about a late-night fireworks party on the beach by the Ambassador Hotel. After my parents fell asleep, Debbie and I snuck out of the motel and took a jitney over to the Ambassador. By the time we arrived, the party was over. It was now 2 a.m., and the jitneys were no longer running, so we decided to hitch a ride back to the motel, which was only 2 miles away. How could we have known that the boys who picked us up were 15 and the car was stolen? We weren't mind readers. When we were stopped by the police and put into the back of a paddy wagon, I tried to explain the situation, but the officers wouldn't listen. It was about 4 a.m. when the Margate police called my father at the motel. They said they had arrested his daughter for car theft and he should come down to the precinct. He said this must be a mistake. His daughter was sound asleep in the other room. It soon became clear that Debbie and I had never met the boys before, but naturally my father was furious. I was grounded, Debbie was sent home. My parents had had enough of my bad behavior. My father said I was a juvenile delinquent destined for a life of depravity. Sorry, I just lied. What he actually called me was a slut, and that hurt. Something inside me was broken and needed to be fixed. Why was I desperate for excitement? This and the shoplifting incident were enough to drive my mother to seek professional help. I was her problem child. The waiting room to Dr. Greenberg's office had kitty magazines like Highlights for Children and Jack and Jill, scattered on colorful little plastic tables, the kind of tiny tables you'd find in kindergarten rooms, along with toys, stuffed animals, and puzzles. Back then, few kids went to psychiatrists, certainly none that I knew of. And I hated the psychiatrist for no other reason than I was forced to sit opposite him for 50 minutes, whether I wanted to talk or not. I had no choice but to look at his ridiculously happy family photos, weddings, graduations, bar mitzvahs, in gold frames on his desk and lining his walls. Coincidentally, he was the father of a girl I vaguely knew from the Sunday school classes I was now forced to attend. I thought she was boring. After long periods of silence, when finally cajoled into speaking, I spent the remainder of the session talking about why I didn't like his daughter and the matchy-matchy clothes she wore. My behavior was obnoxious, but I felt like I was suffocating. Still, that's no excuse. The only trouble I had in my life was the trouble I was creating for myself. After 7 or 8 sessions, it was decided that either I was cured or never would be, and my therapy came to an abrupt end. But I was now a pariah. I was the girl my friends' parents didn't want their nice daughters to associate with. They said I was a bad influence. I pretended I didn't care, but secretly I did. Back then, girls were put into categories. You were either a good girl or a bad girl. There was no in between. And when you're told something enough times, you begin to believe it. So, I would take on a new identity. I would embrace my badness. "I'll show you all," I said in my mind to my friends' parents, also to my own. You should be dancing. Bee Gees. My mother thought I needed moral guidance and had enrolled me in Sunday school classes at the local synagogue, Knesset Israel. I knew I was walking on eggshells, so I went to avoid an argument. It also gave me the opportunity to skip out of class early and catch the bus up Cheltenham Avenue to Wagner's ballroom with my friend Madeline. Madeline came from the only bohemian family in June Meadows, and her mother didn't make her go to Sunday school. Madeline's mother wore her black hair pulled back in a ponytail with a headband. Madeline's older sister was a beatnik who wore smoky eye makeup and went to art college in New York. Madeline's mother wasn't judgmental. She was one of the few mothers who hadn't banned me from their house. Wagner's ballroom was where the badass Catholic school kids went to dance. Madeline loved to dance, and so did I. It's a Philly thing. Hometown to Dick Clark's American Bandstand, the first teenage dance show to be televised nationally in 1957. Madeline took dancing more seriously than I did, and was probably the better dancer. But we were the only 2 white girls in the Abington High School dance club. We knew the latest line dances along with all the choreography. We were obsessed with Motown. The other white kids at Abington did a lame version of the Hully Gully or the Frug, which we considered queer. The word had a different meaning back then. In an act of half-assed self-reinvention, I called myself suicidal when I went to Wagner's, as if that somehow blurred my ethnicity and suburbanness. I thought it sounded tough. The dance was hosted by a legendary DJ, Jerry Blavitt, a.k.a. the Geeter with the Heater, a.k.a. the Big Boss with the Hot Sauce. He was a wiry little guy, half Jewish, half Italian, with a supercharged personality, a smile that took up half his face, and possible connections to the Philadelphia mob. This was back in the good old days of payola, when the mob and the record business were like husband and wife. Blavitt had a radio show and played black music at a time when few white radio DJs did. He was a precursor to the superstar club mixers of the 80s and 90s, one song seamlessly morphing into the next. He knew exactly how to rev up a room filled with horny teenagers. We would dance for 3 hours straight, our clothes drenched with sweat. Boys carried their mothers' dish towels hanging from their back pockets to mop their faces in between songs. I also went to Super Lou's TV dance party after school with my friend Ivy. This was a televised dance show, broadcast live at 4 p.m. from the basement of an apartment building in Jenkintown, not far from our high school, and down the street from where actor Bradley Cooper would grow up 8 years later. The show, hosted by Super Lou, aired on Channel 29. It was 1967, before the advent of cable TV, so there were only 7 TV stations. The big 3, ABC, CBS, and NBC, plus 3 local UHF channels, 17, 29, and 48, but you needed a separate television dial to access those. There was also PBS, watched only by grandparents, geeks, and our world civilization teacher, Miss Rapowski. Channel 29 must have been desperate for cheap local programming, since most of the shows were community news reports, religious talk shows, and a low-budget kiddie program that involved hand puppets, a copycat version of Sherry Lewis and Lamb Chop. I don't know why Little Richard would agree to be a guest on Super Lou's dance party. It must have been a very low point in his career, because the show had a tiny viewership, mostly the friends and family of the teenage dancers. But little Richard lip-synced his way through Tutti Frutti while a bunch of white 15-year-olds tried their best to keep up. I remember his appearance because it was the first time I'd ever seen a man wearing a black wig and pancake makeup with plucked, arched eyebrows. It was unusual. So naturally, I was fascinated. Born to be Wild, Steppenwolf. In the 1960s, there were minimal expectations placed on young women, other than to look pretty and be smart enough to catch a husband. And it was never too early to start planning for the future. Maybe you'd go to college, get a job for a few years, teach kindergarten, a job that had a practical application for motherhood, then give it all up when you got your MRS degree. In fact, if you were too intelligent, you didn't want to show it. Being smart wasn't attractive. But I was secretly competitive and determined, and those were not considered positive traits in a girl, so throughout high school I hid that as best I could. Ambitious men were strong and enterprising. Ambitious women were bitches. I was an artsy kid who wanted to color outside the lines. I liked designing things and became my family's official hairstylist, although my sister still blames me for cutting her long locks into that asymmetrical Vidal Sassoon haircut made popular by Barbra Streisand in 1967. You know the one, rounded on top, short on one side to show an ear, longer on the other. It was the night before Denise's bat mitzvah, so that hairstyle will forever be memorialized in my parents' laminated photo albums, along with my Marlo Thomas-inspired That Girl flip. At some point, I decided to channel my creativity into fashion. I became obsessed with swinging London. That was the groovy, free-spirited lifestyle I fantasized about. I loved the miniskirts, Mary Quant tights, patent leather boots, pale Yardley lipstick. The music of the British invasion, the Spencer Davis Group, the Kinks, the Rolling Stones, the style of Julie Christie. I wanted to be tall, leggy, and stick-thin like Twiggy, Penelope Tree, and Verushka. Flat-chested women with androgynous bodies who looked great in A-line dresses. Women physically my opposite. They were a counterpoint to the big-breasted, wasp-waisted women of the 50s. Curvy women like my mother, who wore long-line bras and tight elastic girdles to squeeze their stomachs and cinch their waists. I experimented with a variety of creative but misguided beauty tips. Twiggy-inspired, painted-on bottom eyelashes that looked like spiders' legs crawling out from under my eyes. Black cat's eye liner, post-Ronnie Spector, pre-Amy Winehouse, with a thin white line painted above it like a skunk. I even shaded a dimple on my chin, like Diana Ross. At some point, I decided to shave off my eyebrows and recreate them in a more dramatic arch with a kohl pencil. I bleached 2 stripes down the sides of my hair like Cruella de Vil. I was trying on various identities to see if any would stick. For my senior year class trip, I went to London, the mod capital of the world. I had little interest in seeing Big Ben, Buckingham Palace, or the changing of the guard, but couldn't wait to get to Carnaby Street and the Biba department store. It was a few years after Carnaby Street's heyday, so it had gone from being a trendy shopping area to a tourist attraction, but still it was eye-opening for a 17-year-old aspiring fashionista. I bought my brother Richie an ice blue satin shirt with a ruffle down the front and billowy sleeves, the new Victorian style worn by the band members of the Dave Clark Five. Richie thought the shirt was cool and wore it to school for his 5th grade photo day. Unfortunately, he almost got beat up by a neighborhood bully named Chipper on his way home. I felt terrible. My little brother was a fashion victim and it was all my fault. In 1967, a new girl arrived at Abington High who looked like Twiggy but smaller. Her name was Gail and she was my first girl crush. In fact, I think everyone had a crush on Gail, boys and girls, probably teachers too. She had huge blue Cupid doll eyes and a short pixie haircut like Mia Farrow's in Rosemary's Baby. She looked like an exotic creature who had just temporarily landed in suburbia, but would not be staying for long. She was also slightly dangerous, which was part of her allure. Rona Gale, she actually had a stage name, had been a child actress, star of the original New York production of The Miracle Worker, a role that would eventually be played by Patty Duke on Broadway. Her photograph had been in newspapers, and she'd traveled around the world performing. I hoped some of her worldliness would rub off on me. I was excited when we became friends, and both got a job go-go dancing, wearing mini dresses, white go-go boots, and fishnets in the window of a hip British clothing boutique called Paraphernalia in Center City. She was an exhibitionist, and I was her exhibitionist in training. At 16, Gail quit school and left the suburbs to move to Manhattan and restart her acting career. But what she was really chasing was adventure. The suburbs of Philadelphia were too small for her. Although Huntington Valley was only 90 miles away, New York City was another planet. Gail's parents allowed her to move into the Barbizon Hotel for Women on East 63rd Street, thinking that living in a women's residential hotel might protect her. They still had women's hotels back then, where no men were allowed above the first floor. It was intended as a safe refuge for young women who had come to the big city seeking fame or fortune as journalists, actresses, dancers, or executive secretaries. Some of the Barbizon's famous guests included Lauren Bacall, Grace Kelly, and Joan Didion. But nothing could protect Gail from herself. We lost touch for a few years. While I was living the life of a college student in Philadelphia, she was trying out the life of Holly Golightly, but in reality it was far less glamorous than in the movie. I bumped into Gail when I moved to New York City in the mid-70s and was sad to see that the sparkle in her eyes had dulled. She looked emaciated and pale, like the blood had been drained out of her. The person I'd known was no longer there. I don't know how she was earning money, but it wasn't from acting. A few years later, she was found dead from an overdose on the bathroom floor of a restaurant in Midtown Manhattan. She was 28. Another adventuress who left Huntington Valley for the bright lights big city was Nancy Spungen. Like Gail, she met an early end in 1978 inside the Chelsea Hotel, presumably stabbed to death by her punk musician boyfriend, Sid Vicious of the Sex Pistols. Their turbulent, heroin-fueled relationship would later be turned into the cult movie Sid and Nancy. Actor Gary Oldman would play Sid, but more about him 25 years from now. I didn't know Nancy Spungen personally. She was a few years younger, but I knew where she came from and what she was running to. I've heard she was self-destructive and emotionally unstable, and I have no doubt that was true. She was only 20 at the time of her death, and when I later saw a photo of her mother, a pretty dark-haired woman, I realized she could have easily been a friend of my mom's. I could imagine them sitting around our suburban kitchen table, chatting and drinking Sanka. Gail and Nancy were both buried outside of Philadelphia on October 15th, exactly 1 year apart. Their life stories would influence a fictional character I named Wren, the protagonist of my first film, Smithereens. But that's a decade and a daydream away, because right now, I'm still in high school, trying to figure out who I want to be when I grow up. Dream a little dream of me. The Mamas and the Papas. In the beginning of senior year, students were given an aptitude test by the school's guidance counselor. The test was a series of multiple-choice questions to help you focus on a future career path and figure out what college options best suited your interests. My test result said I should be a librarian. A what? At first I was horrified. A librarian? Boring. Wasn't a super exciting job like being the fashion editor of Glamour magazine, obviously a much better fit. Librarians were old maids who wore glasses on chains around their neck and smelled musty. What I didn't realize was that the aptitude test got it right. A librarian loves stories. So did I. I had become an avid reader. My personal fuck you to Mrs. K, my fourth grade teacher. I would go to the Wanamaker's department store in downtown Philadelphia and search through the book department, often buying paperbacks based on their striking graphic cover designs. These were books I couldn't find in our school library. Slim volumes of poetry written by poets like Gregory Corso, Lawrence Ferlinghetti, Leroy Jones, and Allen Ginsberg. Novels by French writers like Albert Camus and Jean-Paul Sartre. Although I'm not sure I fully understood all of what I was reading, I liked the flow of the words. I knew they were pushing boundaries, and that made them exciting. They also held the promise of taking me somewhere I might want to live one day. London, Paris, New York, Maybe San Francisco, home to hippies and beatniks. My sister and I kept our books stashed privately in our bedrooms. The only books I remember in our den, the suburban word for family room, were volumes of old leather-bound books with gold trim that my mother's interior decorator, Mr. Alice Andrino, a man with a girl's name, fascinating, had placed on the shelves of our built-in bookcase as set dressing. The book covers were color-coordinated to match our couch and shag rug. Being a film director wasn't a career option on a high school aptitude test in 1969. But filmmaking is about storytelling, so I guess I ended up in the right place. My mother suggested I consider becoming a lawyer. Law school involved books and a lot of reading. All Jewish parents want their kids to become doctors or lawyers. In the case of a daughter, if not become one, marry one. I think my mother was living out her own fantasies through her children. She was a savvy operator and often succeeded in convincing you that her ideas were your own. But being her firstborn, I was strong-willed and figured she still had 2 more shots with my siblings. I was not interested in studying law, nor had I been very good at abiding by it. There was a creative world out there I wanted to be a part of and hoped art might be my entrance ticket, so I applied to the fashion design program at Drexel University, then called by its less fancy name, Drexel Institute of Technology, and was accepted. A few years later, my mom was successful at convincing my younger sister to go to law school. But Denise always loved a good argument and was a natural debater. And as for my pot-growing baby brother, who fantasized about being a rock and roll drummer, well, he would become the doctor, a pulmonologist, as determined at birth. I've always had an interest in people who were different. That's what led to my friendship with Billy B. Billy was gay at a time when no one was out of the closet, especially not in high school, especially not in Huntington Valley. I knew he was gay, but it was something we never spoke about. I was waiting for him to bring it up, but he never did, until the year after he graduated high school. This was decades before gay and lesbian couples could even dream of marrying, having kids, and becoming just as boring as their suburban heterosexual neighbors. What made things more difficult for Billy was that his father was a well-known college football coach back when the words gay and football were not mentioned in the same sentence. In fact, homosexuality officially didn't exist in our suburb, although everyone knew that the hairdressers at the shopping center beauty parlor were effeminate. Billy had a larger-than-life personality and lots of platonic girlfriends. He had a loud, excitable laugh and a camera usually dangling from his neck to document his friends' daily lives. He enjoyed sitting around a kitchen table late at night, gossiping. My mother was also a big talker, and I remember several times after a long night out, Billy would come back to my house, I would be tired and go to bed, leaving my mother and Billy laughing and drinking coffee until 3 a.m. Billy was my date for senior prom. He could always be counted on to fill in an emergency. Somewhere I have a prom photo of the two of us, arm in arm. I'm wearing black satin bell-bottoms, a turquoise blue cummerbund, and a black magician's cape with turquoise lining. It's unclear what fashion statement I was going for at the time. Merlin, perhaps? But it was definitely a misfire. Billy is dressed in a classic black tux with red paisley trim. He went to college for a few years at Penn State, then escaped to New York City to become a photographer. I caught up with him when I moved to the city. He was the only person I knew in Manhattan, and by that time he was out and living a fabulous life with a group of young, up-and-coming fashion designers, one of whom had a promising career that would be cut short by a mysterious gay cancer no one had ever heard of before. In the fall of 1973, Billy would get me my first paying job as a dresser for an afternoon fashion show at the Continental Baths, a gay bathhouse in the basement of the Ansonia Hotel. It was the first time I'd ever been to such a theatrical and decadent place. I loved it. It was a hint of all the secret worlds that existed in NYC, hidden away in surprising places at unexpected times of the day. All the models walked down a makeshift runway in just bath towels. I'm not sure what they were actually modeling. Towels? It was my job to make sure they were wrapped and pinned in such a way so as to keep their towel on. Although walking the runway naked was also an option. The entertainment for the event was a young Bette Midler, nicknamed Bathhouse Betty, with Barry Manilow on piano and Melissa Manchester singing backup. But I was so mesmerized by the weirdness of the experience, I paid little attention to the performances of these soon-to-be very famous entertainers. Billy and I continued to hang out occasionally, but he was now living a fast life, clubbing downtown, partying on Fire Island, and I was an exhausted film student. A few years later, he would move to LA and start a lucrative greeting card company featuring drag queens like Divine on the cover. Inside were messages like, "Turning 30 is a drag." But, oh no, I've done it again. I've let my story jump ahead. New York City is still 90 miles away, and the gay cancer wouldn't make its terrifying appearance for another decade. Who are you? The Who. When I left for college, I wanted to start fresh. I no longer felt like a Sue and wanted to distance myself from that rebellious, confused teenager. I was still searching for a new identity, and for a moment thought about changing my name to Suzanne, Susanna, Suki, or Olivia, my middle name. Someone named Olivia sounded sophisticated and intellectual, but in the end, I went back to just plain Susan. I moved into Drexel's women's dorm, Van Rensselaer Hall, in the fall of 1969. It was an ugly white stone building on Powelton Avenue and 33rd Street, in a deteriorating part of West Philadelphia. House rules were strict. You had to sign in and out at the front desk every time you came and went. There was an 11 p.m. curfew on weeknights and a 1 a.m. curfew on weekends. Boys were not allowed above the lobby floor. Powelton Avenue would make national headlines a few years later when a large, crumbling house occupied by the members of MOVE, a controversial Black Power group, had a shootout with the police that left 1 officer dead and 9 MOVE members in jail. Protests to free the MOVE members would lead to police firebombings in 1985 that would destroy 2 city blocks and leave 6 more dead. I shared a dorm room with a friendly, heavyset girl named Michelle. Her mother had packed her off to college with a supply of diet pills. This was back when family doctors thought nothing of handing out amphetamines as casually as jelly beans. Michelle became very popular with the other girls in the dorm, especially around finals time. Design classes were taught by instructors who took the train in from Manhattan twice a week. There was a sophistication about them that the Philadelphia faculty members didn't have, as if inhaling New York City air automatically made you chic. At Drexel, the male-female student ratio was 5-1. Many of the men were slightly geeky engineering, computer science, and business majors. Who knew they would become the rock stars of the 1990s? In the 70s, they were still just nerds. The female students fell into 2 categories: library science and home economics majors, conservative girls from Western Pennsylvania and Central New Jersey, and design majors, artsy girls who wore native headbands with long, poker-straight hair parted down the center, bell-bottoms, leather fringe vests, and clogs. The disproportionate number of male students would have been advantageous for a girl who was husband shopping. I wasn't. Although within a month of my arrival, I had a boyfriend named Michael and quickly went about the business of losing my virginity. I wanted to get it over and done with so I could stop thinking about it and move on. I remember waking up the next morning and looking in the mirror, surprised to see that nothing had changed. Would other people notice a difference? I don't know what I was expecting, but I was still me. Michael and I were boyfriend and girlfriend for the entire freshman year. We went to movies, to concerts, listened to scratchy Jefferson Airplane albums on his record player, and smoked lots of pot, the harsh kind, full of seeds. I drew naked charcoal sketches of him for my life drawing class, feeling very creative and grown up. In November of my freshman year, I was chosen as Drexel's homecoming queen. There was nothing about me that was typically homecoming queenish. Personally, I identified more as a hippie than a rah-rah, but my pre-feminist ego was stroked. I also had little interest in football, or most sports for that matter. I didn't understand the rules and why there were so many stops and starts. Seated on a cold metal bleacher in a plaid miniskirt and crocheted vest on a blustery afternoon, What I remember most was wishing someone would offer me a flask to keep warm. Still, I was flattered to be part of an American tradition that in the rapidly changing world of 1970 suddenly seemed anachronistic. Hippie culture was taking hold on college campuses across America. This was a time when students smoked weed with their professors. It would be the year of Kent State. I remember walking into the Quad, Drexel's student gathering hall, on December 1st, 1970, the day the draft lottery system started. Your birth date would now dictate the order you were called up for military service. A bunch of college students quit school the following week after they found out their lottery number was high and would now be last in line to be drafted for Vietnam. Everyone read books by Kurt Vonnegut, Catch-22 by Joseph Heller, Siddhartha by Hermann Hesse, and Future Shock by Alvin Toffler. I ate my first kiwi and tasted my first avocado. I tried Indian curries and went to macrobiotic restaurants, a radical change from the TV dinners and all-you-can-eat Chinese buffets I'd grown up with. I listened to James Taylor, Joni Mitchell, and played Carole King's first album over and over and over. I joined an encounter group. I chanted Nam Myoho Renge Kyo at a makeshift Buddhist temple in the basement of a coffee house near Rittenhouse Square. I dropped acid and watched my fingers melt into multicolored waves of light, feeling at one with the universe. I also received news from my friend Debbie that her high school boyfriend had been killed in Vietnam after being there for only a month. I remember exactly where I was standing at the time, talking to her from a payphone in the hallway of my dorm. I was stunned. I'd never known anyone who was killed in a war before. During my last year of high school, I'd become friendly with a German exchange student named Tony. We'd kept in touch, and she invited me to stay at her family's apartment in Frankfurt the summer after my freshman year of college. I took a cheap Pan Am flight to Frankfurt with a copy of Arthur Fromer's Europe on $5 a day and $200 worth of American Express traveler's checks tucked inside my embroidered Indian shoulder bag. I also had a student Eurail pass that was good for unlimited train travel for a month. I'd never traveled south of Miami, north of Montreal, or west of Scranton, Pennsylvania. My world was about to expand. Magical Mystery Tour. The Beatles. I arrived in Germany and loved everything about its foreignness. I loved that the buildings were old, the streets were cobbled, the people spoke a language I couldn't understand, and ate foods I'd never tasted. I stayed for a week with Tony and her parents in their apartment above the restaurant they owned in Frankfurt. I remember the first time her mother brewed chamomile tea. I had never tasted chamomile before and liked its floral aroma. It was very different than the Lipton's powdered tea mix we drank at home. As her mother poured tea, I noticed the faint blue numbers tattooed on her forearm. Her father had them too. I knew what the numbers signified, a horror I couldn't possibly imagine. Still, I wondered why after the Holocaust, Tony's parents would return to Germany, a place that had caused them so much suffering. Tony told me they had been unable to enter the United States because of restrictive immigration policies, so they went to Palestine instead. But Palestine was a harsh desert land and they were city people, Europeans, and felt like strangers in that dry Middle Eastern place. Despite all the unspeakable things they'd lived through, they returned to the country where they had once been part of a community, hoping they could pick up some of the pieces and start again. And they did. They now owned several restaurants in Frankfurt and had prospered. The irony was that Tony had met a Sabra, Israeli-born boy, when she was visiting relatives in Tel Aviv and had fallen in love. She planned to return to Israel to see if, unlike her parents, she could start a new life there. After a week in Germany, Tony and I drove her Mustang from Frankfurt to Venice, where it was put on a ship to be ferried to Tel Aviv. I left Tony in Venice and decided to bum around Europe for a few weeks. I had a Eurail pass so I could move around easily, sometimes sleeping overnight in the train compartment rather than paying for a room. Once I woke up to find a sad-looking young German soldier fondling my bare feet. At the time, the US dollar was strong and Europe was cheap. There were plenty of youth hostels, and you could actually bump into people you knew from back home while checking out the message board at the American Express office in any major city. For a while, Amsterdam was the place to be. It was crowded with American and European hippies hanging out at Dom Square, camping in sleeping bags, so at night you'd have to step over sleeping bodies to get across the plaza. Marijuana was legal, cheap, and readily available. Youth hostels had co-ed dorms, some with bunk beds, that only cost 75 cents a night. What was originally intended as a 21-day trip stretched to 4 months. Needless to say, my parents were not pleased and were unwilling to support my extended stay. I decided to join Tony in Israel, because if you worked on a kibbutz, you could get free room and board. I found a kibbutz near the Golan Heights, where I spent 2 months sleeping on a military cot in a corrugated metal hut with 4 other women. We picked grapefruit each morning. Our afternoons were free for sightseeing or swimming because it was too hot to work in the fields. I befriended a girl from Boston named Rona, and we took a cheap flight to Istanbul, another hippie destination at that time. With the help of Arthur Frommer, we found an inexpensive pensione near the majestic Blue Mosque. We spent our afternoons hanging out at a nearby cafe called the Pudding Shop, eating baklava and kunafe and drinking thick Turkish coffee. The Pudding Shop was also a boarding point on the hippie trail. This is where a battered, psychedelically painted bus loaded up with passengers before heading overland through Iran, Afghanistan, Pakistan, and India, eventually ending up in Nepal. The goal was to get to Nepal as cheaply as possible. There were ramshackle hotels at stopping points along the way. Back then, Nepal was a popular destination for nonconformist travelers because it was the birthplace of Buddha. Not to mention the cheap cannabis and opium that could be bought along the way. Every afternoon, the military police would raid the Pudding Shop, ostensibly looking for drugs, but mostly as an excuse to pat down, feel up, the American hippie chicks hanging out there. The hippie trail would come to an abrupt end by 1979 due to the military dictatorship in Pakistan, the Iranian Revolution, and the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, which closed off tourism to Westerners. I never hopped on the bus, but it was wonderful to know that for a brief period of time, this magical mystery tour had actually existed, back when the world was a very different place. I'm every woman. Shaka Khan. I returned home a different person. It's like a switch had been turned on in my head. In many ways, I'd been a typical suburban teenager, until one day I wasn't. I'd walked through souks in Turkey and had sex on a beach by the Red Sea. I'd eaten fresh figs in Rome and lamb shawarma in Jerusalem. I'd gotten a taste of a bigger, more colorful world that I now wanted to be part of. I couldn't go back to beefaroni. My sophomore year at Drexel had been in session for 2 months when I returned to Philadelphia. I tried to get back into the swing of college life, but the idea of living in a women's dorm on Powelton Avenue was depressing, so I moved into an apartment on 44th and Spruce with 3 other roommates. The courses in the fashion design program had become more technical: sewing, tailoring, pattern making. I knew that if I wanted to be a professional fashion designer, I'd need to have those skills, but I was 19 and too impatient to sit behind a sewing machine. Besides, it reminded me of my 10th grade home economics class, where girls were taught how to sew aprons and make cinnamon toast, while boys took shop and made wooden birdhouses. There were now other things I wanted to learn, so I transferred out of the fashion program and into the humanities department. This was the dumping ground for all the disenfranchised engineering and design students who wanted to change their major but didn't want to lose academic credits by transferring to another university. I enrolled in a German language class, 19th century Russian literature, and a course called Film Appreciation 101. It was a Mickey Mouse class where I could earn an easy 4 credits just by watching movies and writing about them. The world is seemingly random and irrational, yet the paths we take often make sense, if only in retrospect. Here's an example. Instead of Film Appreciation 101, I could have chosen Music Appreciation 101 or Introduction to Psychology. All had the same number of credits and were of equal interest at the time. But Film Appreciation 101 was taught in a time slot that better fit my schedule, so I enrolled. I had no idea this would change my life. I didn't come from a highly educated family. My mother had natural intelligence, but having married straight out of high school, she'd never gone to college. I think that bothered her. So with one daughter already out of the house and another soon to graduate, she decided to go back to school. My mother and I would both be college students at the same time, although thankfully not at the same school. And here's what I recognize now, something I didn't realize back then. From the outside, my mother's life looked happy and content, but I think she was seeking something too. She wanted to be someone different from whom she'd been brought up to be. Maybe someone more worldly, more knowledgeable, more creative. And that aspirational desire to push boundaries would be passed on to her kids. It wasn't an actual goal, it was an attitude. The confidence to move beyond your comfort zone without fear of failure. I remember coming home one weekend to see my mother with her new college friends, women my own age, sitting around our kitchen table, laughing and drinking coffee, and I couldn't help but wonder if my mom was having a better college experience than I was. But I was happy that at 40, she was getting the education she'd always wanted. And my father, the self-made, self-confident, successful businessman who had dropped out of high school, was never threatened by anything my mother wanted to do, always supportive of her new goals. During my junior year at Drexel, I had a teacher that I'll call Phil. I had just turned 20. He was 27 and a freelance movie critic for a local Philadelphia newspaper. He showed classic American and foreign films in his Film Appreciation 102 class. I'd never seen Citizen Kane or Ingmar Bergman's The Seventh Seal. I'd never heard of directors named Truffaut, Fellini, or Antonioni. It was like having cataracts removed from my eyes, only to realize there was an entirely different world of filmmaking I knew nothing about. I'd originally taken the class merely to get an easy 4 credits toward graduation. Unexpectedly, I had my mind blown. I was suddenly paying attention to things I hadn't noticed before. How a shot was framed, how a character was introduced into a scene, how a screenplay was structured. I realized that you can tell a compelling story and give it an ambiguous ending, as Truffaut did in The 400 Blows, or Fellini in Nights of Cabiria. You could capture psychological truths and inner emotions using camera framing, as in Bergman's Persona. You could disrupt the traditional flow of the narrative, even break the fourth wall and look directly into the camera, like Jean-Luc Godard did in almost all of his films. There were so many different ways to tell stories I hadn't thought about before. Phil became my mentor. He took me to morning film screenings, the kind that only critics get invited to. He also became my lover. That sounds romantic, doesn't it? Basically, we just started having sex midweek after class. Our pedagogic relationship had turned personal, not uncommon in the heated college campus atmosphere of the early 70s, a time when workplace ethics ranged from ambiguous to non-existent. When I view this now through a 21st century lens, I can't help but feel some mixed emotions. He was my teacher. I was his student. There was definitely an imbalance of power, but at the time I didn't see it that way. Phil was funny, acerbic, and loved talking about movies, and I loved listening. Actually, he loved holding forth about many things, but neglected to mention that he was in a long-term relationship with another woman he saw on weekends, hence our midweek sex. I would find this out, eventually. Her name was Marian. She was 10 years my senior, had a beautiful 3-year-old daughter, Jillian, from a previous marriage, and was working on her PhD in psychology. Marian knew about me and was very clever. Instead of feeling threatened or angry, she invited me to Phil's birthday party at her home, where we spent the entire evening holed up in her bedroom, sitting on a big pile of coats, talking. Surprisingly, we liked each other almost immediately, and she asked me to join her women's group. It was 1972. Ms. Magazine, the first American feminist monthly magazine, was now available at newsstands, and women's consciousness-raising groups were all the rage. I was the youngest member of my group, but figured I could learn something from the others. These were not women sitting in a circle examining their vaginas with hand mirrors. These were intelligent women talking about sexual politics, female empowerment, equal rights. Several had married straight out of college and were now divorced or in the process of becoming so. They felt they had been sold a false bill of goods back when being married was a sign of a woman's worth. I ran out and bought books by Betty Friedan, Kate Millett, and Germaine Greer. Germaine Greer, the author of The Female Eunuch, a 1970 feminist treatise about female sexuality, famously said that a woman isn't truly emancipated until she has tasted her own menstrual blood. This was a gastronomic treat that would never make it onto my menu. Years later, when I was about to give birth to my son, someone gave me a recipe for placenta soup. Another dish I never tried, although I've heard that eating placenta has now become popular. Apparently, celebrity moms trade recipes online for how to make the best placenta smoothie. I read Our Bodies, Ourselves and privately studied my own vagina with a mirror. I bought poetry and novels by Sylvia Plath, Virginia Woolf, and Anne Sexton, and wondered why talented women committed suicide. Was that the fate of a smart, creative woman, sticking your head in the oven, walking into the sea with a pocket full of stones? Before then, I had never thought much about feminism. I had been focused on escape. But now that I understood what the term meant, I realized that this was what I was, a feminist. I wanted to be independent and empowered. I wanted the opportunity to be whoever the hell I wanted to be, as soon as I figured out what that was. And I got the message that if a male-dominated society was going to stand in my way, I'd have to create these opportunities for myself. Long story short, sisterhood won out. I became friends with Marion and ended my fling with Phil, although we would remain friendly for the next few years. Eventually, we lost touch, but I'll forever be grateful to him for opening my eyes to the possibilities of cinema, and for introducing me to Marion. Marion and I would remain friends for life. By my final year of college, I'd taken Film Appreciation 101, 102, 103, and 104. There were no hands-on production courses at Drexel, so I never got to actually make a short film. Graduation was rapidly approaching, and I still didn't know what I wanted to be, but I now had a general direction. Although I loved watching movies, I'd never thought seriously about making one. Were there even any female movie directors? Was that a realistic goal? On a whim, I applied to 3 graduate film school programs, 2 in Philadelphia, 1 in New York City. I had nothing to show as a film sample and was rejected by the 2 in Philly. Those would be the best 2 rejections of my life. Blinded by the Light. Manfred Mann's Earth Band. Maybe I would have made it to New York City anyway, but this gave me the push I needed to get there. Film schools were not very popular in 1973 when I took the train into Manhattan for an interview at New York University's Graduate Film School. The idea that you could teach film in an academic setting wouldn't become widespread until the 90s, when suddenly every major university had a film department, and independent film academies were popping up like weeds all across the country. Filmmaking programs were sexy academic moneymakers. Every kid suddenly wanted to direct. I had a meeting with the admissions committee, a group of 4 men and 1 woman. I was sure the other applicants had been making movies with their parents' Super 8 cameras since they were 10 and was worried about my lack of hands-on experience. I had nothing to show except my early fashion design portfolio, but hoped my enthusiasm for cinema would come through. It did. I was accepted. Unlike warm, sunny West Coast cities, Manhattan is not a place where young people go just to hang out. The pulse of the city is not chill. Rents are high, apartments are small, and the weather is bad in winter when bus fumes turn the snow into gray slush and the sidewalks are covered with frozen piles of dog poop. But New York City is electric, a magical place where you could meet fascinating people who did interesting things. There were no artists in my family. No one thought being creative was a realistic career goal. I came from business people with no connection to the entertainment industry. My dad, my uncle, and my grandfather manufactured hardware, practical items that people used in their daily lives. A door lock for security, a screen door to keep out flies, aluminum siding. Art was a hobby, not a job. I don't know if my mother thought I'd ever actually become a movie director, but at least I was getting a master's degree, and she believed in higher education. Maybe film was something I could teach. In her mind, the fallback position was that eventually I'd marry a guy who would take care of me, same as she had. And as for my dad, well, he went along with everything my mother said when it came to the children. Moving to Manhattan was something I'd fantasized about ever since I was a young girl, but as the reality approached, I felt a wave of insecurity. In the suburbs, being different made you stand out. In New York City, no one cared where you came from. Everyone was on the go. It was a tough, competitive town, and I knew only one person there. I found a tiny furnished studio apartment in a 1950s brick building with an elevator on East 9th Street. It was a furnished sublet, and the rent was $135 a month. Not cheap at the time. The apartment had a single window that looked onto an alleyway between two buildings. The man who sublet it to me, a guy in his 40s, had moved in with a woman on the top floor. She had a larger 2-bedroom apartment, but smoked like a chimney, so he would have to live in a cloud of cigarette fumes. It was a trade-off. He would sublet his tiny studio to me and live rent-free with her. Love and real estate go hand in hand in Manhattan. I arrived with 2 suitcases, a carton of books, a typewriter, toiletries, bed sheets, a pillow, and a few personal knickknacks. The existing furniture consisted of a twin-sized cot, a brown plaid couch, a functional wooden coffee table, and 2 folding chairs. In the teeny kitchen nook, there was an under-the-counter mini-fridge, a 2-burner stove, and some basic pots and pans. But following in the Seidelman family tradition, I wasn't much of a cook anyway. I came across some books and old photos stacked in his small closet. Looking through them, I discovered that the man had been a child actor, one of the gang in an early TV series called The Little Rascals, later renamed Spanky and Our Gang. He must have been 4 or 5 at the time. I'm not sure what he did once he grew up, but his apartment was Spartan and sad, and it made me realize that Manhattan was filled with all sorts of aspiring people, some on their way up, others on their way down. Living in New York City changes your sense of privacy, so there's a certain reluctance to become too friendly with your neighbors. You can hear conversations through the wall. You get to know your neighbors' bathroom habits. Toilet flushes sound as loud as PA announcements at an airport. I'd seen the tenants across the alleyway walking around naked. I'd listened to my upstairs neighbor having noisy sex. I was hoping that one day he might hear the same sounds coming from my apartment, but since I hadn't yet made any friends, my romantic life was on hold. I was lonely that first month in the city. My first friend in the building was a slightly stooped elderly man in his mid-70s who lived in a larger apartment down the hall. I would sometimes see him waiting for the elevator, and we would exchange smiles and say hello. His name was Mr. Schlanger, and he reminded me of my grandfather. He told me he had once owned a small hot dog manufacturing company in Brooklyn and made the best frankfurters in town. I'd always enjoyed the stories older people told about growing up during the Depression or their experiences in World War II, so Mr. Schlanger and I would exchange a few words when we bumped into each other in the hallway. I sensed he was lonely too. One Sunday afternoon, Mr. Schlanger invited me into his apartment for a cup of coffee. We sat on the couch chatting, his radio tuned to a classical music station. He put out a tray of Ritz crackers and little cubes of orange cheese with individual fancy toothpicks. I thought it was sweet, something my grandmother might do. His apartment was furnished with an assortment of French provincial furniture that came from his former living room in Queens. It was the kind of furniture his wife must have picked out in 1950, still pristine as if it had been covered in plastic for the past 20 years. Mr. Schlanger told me stories about the sausage business, how he sold his hot dogs to some of the small kiosks in Coney Island. I asked him about his wife, his children. He was a retired widower, and his kids no longer visited him very often. Then, he leaned over and tried to kiss me on the lips. The old-fashioned music playing in my head came to a screeching halt. I pushed Mr. Schlanger away and tried to stand up. He tried to hold me down, but there was no force in his action. I easily managed to get off the couch and hurried out of his apartment. I felt more shocked than violated. My faith in the sweetness of little old men instantly turned sour. From then on, I would peek out of my apartment door to make sure the coast was clear before heading to the elevator. Once classes started, my schedule changed. I was busy and no longer home in the afternoons. I avoided bumping into Mr. Schlanger for several months, sometimes dawdling on the sidewalk if I saw him entering the building to avoid an awkward elevator encounter. Around Christmas time, there was a knock on my door. I peeked through the viewing hole and saw Mr. Schlanger standing in the hallway, but I pretended I wasn't home. He slid an envelope under my door. It was a holiday card along with one of those old-timey promotional wall calendars, the pin-up kind you see hanging on the walls of gas stations and auto body shops. His company's name was printed boldly across the top, and each month featured a photo of a different sausage that was manufactured by Schlanger & Sons. That was my introduction to dating in NYC. With a little help from my friends, the Beatles. NYU's Graduate Film School was located on 7th Street near 2nd Avenue, in the heart of the East Village. The famous, now defunct rock venue, the Fillmore East, was located in the same building. Jim Morrison and Janis Joplin had played there only a few years earlier. Ratner's restaurant was nearby. This is where I'd eat scrambled eggs, lox, and onions for dinner several times a week, served by cranky old Jewish waiters. Other days, I'd buy a $1 hot dog and orange mystery drink from Gray's Papaya on 8th, or dine on cheap Japanese comfort food at Dojo on St. Mark's Place, famous for their delicious carrot ginger salad dressing. The original recipe is still a secret. When I arrived in the East Village in the fall of 1973, the 60s counterculture was already beginning to fade. The neighborhood's burnt-out hippies and junkies, the Hare Krishnas dressed in fraying orange robes, and the peaceniks with beat-up guitars were slowly being overtaken by younger kids, louder and more aggressive, dressed in tight black jeans, leather jackets, and metal-studded collars. Blue spiked hair was replacing graying ponytails. The drugs were changing, too. Pot, hash, and psychedelics were swapped for coke, crack, and heroin. Maybe it was a cynical reaction to the dark turn the counterculture had taken after the maniacal delusions of Charles Manson. The flowers in everyone's hair had wilted. At the time, NYU Film School felt detached from the mainstream film industry. Few of my teachers had connections to the LA studio system. There were 35 students in the class, 30 men and 5 women. Our aspirations were about self-expression and creativity. Our heroes were the French New Wave film directors, rebels like Jean-Luc Godard, François Truffaut, and Alain Resnais. This was a time before artistic value was linked to commercial success. We didn't read trade papers like The Hollywood Reporter or Variety. We didn't know who the LA power agents were, nor did we care. We were naive about the workings of Hollywood. For me, this had a major upside. Had I known how few women would ever get a shot at directing a movie, I might have been demoralized and given up. Ignorance was bliss. New York still had several large repertory cinemas that showed a vast array of foreign films, cult films, and old movie classics. I was hungry for knowledge and had a lot of catching up to do. I'd take the subway up to the Carnegie Hall Cinema on 57th Street and watch 3 movies in a row, starting at noon. For $3.50, you could stay all day. I became a cinemaniac. I scheduled my weekly activities around the screening times of the films I wanted to see. I set my alarm clock for 2 a.m. to watch Preston Sturges's Sullivan's Travels or Mervyn LeRoy's I Am a Fugitive from a Chain Gang on The Late Late Show. Since there was no video yet, your only chance to catch an old movie on TV was to wake up at whatever time it happened to be airing. I took classes on American cinema, looking for role models. Several of the directors we studied were macho men who resembled cowboys or military generals. John Ford, John Huston, and Cecil B. DeMille, who actually wore knee-high riding boots and jodhpurs on set. Some were cigar-smoking, larger-than-life guys in suits, Hitchcock, Orson Welles. There was also a new breed of directors, hipper, younger men who had graduated from the burgeoning film schools on the East and West Coasts. Coppola, Lucas, Scorsese, De Palma, Milius, and Spielberg. Okay, Spielberg had applied to USC's film school and been rejected a few times. These were guys with long hair and scruffy beards who smoked weed and wore baseball caps. Although I respected their talent and rebellious spirit, they seemed as macho in a countercultural way as their predecessors. They were telling stories about machismo and power and viewed the world with a male gaze. I was looking for a woman who might help guide me through uncharted territory, someone whose work I knew and respected. But I could count the number of American women who had directed a film I'd actually seen in a commercial movie theater on one finger. Elaine May, 1972, The Heartbreak Kid. Then, along came Lina Wertmuller. Wertmuller was Italian and had been a protege of Federico Fellini. She branded herself with large, attention-grabbing glasses. She was brazen, fearless, and small, 5 feet tall. But her films were big. She was rebellious, and you could sense her naughty mind at work in all her movies. Wertmuller directed several films in the early to mid-1970s, Swept Away, Seven Beauties, The Seduction of Mimi, her 3 most popular, using dark comedy to make social and political observations. Everything about her films was slightly exaggerated, but still grounded in real human emotion. And although the star of her movies was a man, Giancarlo Giannini, you could feel Wertmuller's touch. Her female characters had strength, her male characters had vulnerability. And she was developing a large body of internationally acclaimed work, something few women had done before her, something I wanted to do. Wertmuller would become the first woman director nominated for an Academy Award in 1975 and was awarded an honorary Oscar in 2019. She died in 2021 at the age of 93. Let me tell you the best thing about film school. You had access to a student crew who would work for free, usually without complaint. Okay, maybe a little complaint, especially if you didn't feed them well. You also got to use the school's camera equipment and editing machines. Plus, you could screw up and no one made fun of you. Then you could fuck up again the second year and the third, hopefully learning from your mistakes. Cinema is a language that I needed to learn. I wanted to understand when to use a close-up, a wide master shot, a two-shot, and over-the-shoulder, when to use an objective or subjective camera, how to film a scene by choreographing the actor's movement to the movement of the camera. I needed to learn the rules of screen direction so a dialogue scene between 2 characters looked like they were actually talking to one another when edited together, not facing in opposite directions, as happened in my first disastrous film exercise. It was like learning a foreign language. There would be lots of trial and error before I understood the basic rules. Rules I wanted to learn so I'd have the confidence to break them one day. I realized that each individual choice made by the director had a cumulative effect on the storytelling. These were the elements that gave a film its personality, its point of view. We see new things through the lens of what we have already seen, said Poet Laureate Natasha Trethewey. So for my first student short film, I decided to explore my suburban past with all my complicated feelings toward it. I would make a movie about a female character I intuitively understood, someone I could have been. The short film, And You Act Like One Too, would be a story about a frustrated housewife who stumbles into an extramarital affair on the day of her 30th birthday. She would be a woman who feels restless, unappreciated, and is desperately seeking something, a recurring theme in the films I would go on to make, although I didn't know that at the time. By 1975, you could feel it in the air. Women reevaluating their traditional role as homemakers in pursuit of power over their own lives. The personal is political was a motto increasingly embraced by feminists over the next few decades. I now had a mission. I wanted to be, 1, a professional woman film director, 2, who told stories about women's lives, 3, as seen through a female lens. Stories that needed to be shared. At NYU, we formed crews of 6 people and rotated positions. We were loaned a 16mm camera and a sound and lighting package and given some rolls of black and white 16mm film. Each student would write, produce, direct, and edit their own short movie. When it was my turn, I took my crew to Huntington Valley, to my parents' house. I would film in my parents' bedroom, kitchen, bathroom, the one with the big S etched on the shower door. I would shoot at the shopping center where I hung out as a teenager, smoking cigarettes behind the bowling alley. I would try to capture the texture of the world I'd grown up in, the place I'd left behind. I filmed my script in a straightforward, dramatic style, but with enough flexibility to allow for spontaneous discovery on set and give the actors some room to improvise. The film had a traditional narrative structure, but an ending with an emotional punch. When the film was finished, I made 3 16mm prints. Every few weeks, I'd lug a print in its heavy metal carrying case over to the post office and wait in line to ship it to a film festival, or a library, or a museum somewhere across America in the hopes of setting up a screening. It was a time-consuming job that involved a lot of schlepping. Today, filmmakers just email a Vimeo link. It takes a certain amount of arrogance and self-delusion to think that anyone other than your family or best friend might be interested in your creative endeavors. So I was genuinely surprised when I got news that my film had been nominated for a 1976 Student Academy Award, and the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences was going to fly me to Los Angeles, along with 11 others, selected from across the country. They would put us all up in a hotel for 3 nights, and there would be an award ceremony and a cash prize. I'd never been to California before, so this was a fairy tale way to visit Hollywood for the first time. But more importantly, it gave me the confidence to think that I could actually direct a film that others might enjoy watching. Maybe filmmaking was something I might be good at. Hotel California, the Eagles. At the Beverly Hilton Hotel, I shared a room with another film student named Karen, the first woman I'd ever met who was an aspiring cinematographer. I lost track of her a few years later, so I don't know if she succeeded in her chosen field, but she had probably picked the one film career even harder for a woman to break into than directing. Being a professional director of photography was basically a closed shop for women wanting to join the camera union in those days. My film didn't win the Student Academy Award, but I was still reeling from the fact that I'd been nominated and got to meet Jack Nicholson at a cocktail party given by the Academy in our honor. He had just won the Oscar for Best Actor for One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest the year before. I'd never seen a real movie star up close. They actually glow. I have a photo of the two of us, me with a ridiculously starstruck grin on my face, him looking down with a quizzical expression. Smack in the center of the photo is a stranger caught in an awkward gesture, his hand reaching up to his nose like he's about to pick a booger. Rather than return straight home to New York, I decided to extend my stay by a few days. Who knew what other celebrities I might meet in this star-studded city? So I got a cheap motel room somewhere off Sunset Boulevard. I wanted to walk around and get a feel for the city. Not a realistic plan, I'd soon find out. I don't remember who recommended the motel or exactly where it was located. I've never had a handle on the street system in LA, but it was clearly in a sketchy part of town, and the excitement and glamour I'd initially felt quickly started to fade. I walked around deserted streets for about an hour, then returned to the motel mildly depressed. Because I didn't have a car, it was impossible to get around other than by taxi. Coming from New York, I was used to walking and public transportation. But without a credit card, a rental car wasn't an option. New York City may be brash and noisy, but LA suddenly felt lonely. Or maybe it was just me feeling lost in this sprawling city that had no center. I spent the night alone, eating takeout in the motel, God knows where. Before leaving for Los Angeles, I'd been given the phone number of a friend who had recently moved out west from New Jersey. The next day, I called him up, and he offered to take me to a barbecue at his girlfriend's house. He mentioned there would be a lot of people there from the East Coast. A little while later, a beat-up jalopy pulled up in front of the crappy motel, and a cheerful guy stepped out. I was surprised to see that he was even shorter than I was, and I'm often the shortest one in the room. It turned out he was an aspiring actor named Danny DeVito, and he drove me to a backyard barbecue at the home of his girlfriend, Rhea Perlman. I didn't know anyone at the party, but everyone was friendly and very optimistic about their future. And I realized that was the key to survival in LA. You needed unwavering hope and an unquestioning belief in yourself. I stayed for a while, trying to muster up my own unbridled enthusiasm, then took a taxi back to the motel. After realizing I was stuck in a creepy part of town with no way to get around and no idea where to go, I called an old high school friend named Linda, who was living in Brentwood. She kindly invited me to stay a few nights with her. The street where Linda lived had a cluster of 2- and 3-story mid-century U-shaped apartment buildings with small swimming pools in the center. She had a cute one-bedroom with a queen-sized waterbed, one of the worst fads of the 70s, along with the Dorothy Hamill bowl haircut. I was grateful she offered to put me up. I spent a few nights in her bed trying not to squirm because the waterbed's undulations made me a little nauseous, and I didn't want to wake up my sleeping friend. Linda was working for a TV production company and had a hunky, non-working actor boyfriend who had once played a comic book hero in a short-lived series. He got to wear a red and blue spandex costume and tights. This was long before wearing tights and a cape made you extremely rich and famous. He had one of those Hollywood actor names like Garrett, although I think his real name was Walter. He had blue eyes, sandy blonde hair, and a slightly round face that is cute at 28, but might not age well. For the next 2 days, Linda, Garrett, and I lounged around Linda's palm tree-lined swimming pool, along with a bunch of other aspiring 20-somethings. Now, I admit, there were a few things about Los Angeles that made me anxious. The sky was too blue, the bougainvillea too pink, and the palm trees looked like set dressing. There was a distinct California style. LA was a city filled with tall, tanned blondes with hair like Farrah Fawcett's. Even Brooklyn Italian, Jewish, and Puerto Rican girls looked Californian after moving there. Whereas Manhattan was a town for sharp-edged brunettes like Dorothy Parker, Nora Ephron, and Fran Lebowitz. I was a brunette, not just in hair color, but also in temperament. The insightful and underappreciated LA writer Eve Babbitt once said something like this: "The reason people in LA are so good-looking is that LA always attracted the body-beautiful people, and New York attracted the smart ones." After a few decades of beautiful people mating with other beautiful people, you end up with a town filled with a lot of beautiful-looking offspring. Even the homeless people in LA looked sort of attractive. At least they were tanned. Without a doubt, the town and many of its inhabitants were lovely on the surface, but underneath I could feel a hint of desperation, as if everyone knew there was a ticking clock, and within a few years they would be substituted by another group of pretty young people already waiting in line to take their place. Maybe I also feared that living in such postcard surroundings would take away my edge or make me insecure. Without the daily hassles of New York City life, I could easily fall into distraction, or become a recreational drug enthusiast. And living in a town where inside every coffee shop there was an aspiring writer, director, actor, producer pitching a project to another aspiring writer, director, actor, producer would be demoralizing. I'd enjoyed my visit to the City of Angels, but was looking forward to returning to the rough-and-tumble streets of downtown New York. I realized that was where I felt most at home. A few days later, I boarded a plane and flew back to JFK with an Academy Award nomination certificate in my suitcase. It was embossed with a little gold Oscar statuette on the letterhead and signed by the then Academy's president, Walter Mirisch. I also took home a runner-up check for $250. When I got back home, it hit me that film school was over, and I wasn't sure what to do next. I had left my NYU nest, but didn't know if I was ready to fly. New York State of Mind. Billy Joel. In the mid-1970s, New York City was a mess and on the verge of bankruptcy, but it was a great time to be young, creative, and reckless. In response to the city's financial crisis, Mayor Abe Beame had laid off thousands of municipal workers and cut back on services such as sanitation pickup and other social programs. Businesses were closing, there was massive unemployment, and many of the city's middle-class residents were moving to the suburbs for work and safer surroundings. They called it white flight. Crime was rampant. Drugs, vandalism, and theft became the norm. Budget cutbacks meant that there were few police on the streets of Manhattan, now nicknamed Fear City. Garbage piled up on the sidewalks. The subways were filthy and broke down frequently. Maybe coming from the protected bubble of the suburbs, I didn't fully comprehend how dangerous the city was. I had little fear taking the subway home alone at 3 a.m. from Midtown to Astor Place, or walking down deserted streets at dawn. I was oblivious to danger, even though the newspapers reported daily stories about subway muggings and chain snatchers. but I wore no jewelry and blended in easily. It wasn't until David Berkowitz, the son of Sam, began his killing spree in July 1976 that I became more cautious, since he targeted mostly white women with long dark hair, and I fit that description. And out of this mess came a movement that would change New York culture. Because no one was paying attention, the Lower East Side morphed from a rundown slum into a creative incubator for aspiring artists. In chaos lies opportunity. Subway cars became huge canvases for graffiti artists. Crumbling walls and storefronts became bulletin boards covered with fly posters advertising the latest clubs and emerging bands. Some walls, like the one on St. Mark's Place, were so overlaid with Xeroxed flyers that you could pull off chunks half an inch thick. Abandoned tenement buildings became pop-up galleries and performance spaces where electricity was shared through a Rube Goldberg-esque tangle of wires and cables reaching into adjoining buildings. A shithole country and western bar on the Bowery became the landmark punk club CBGB. Even Ratner's kosher dairy restaurant became a hip hangout. And suddenly, everyone had a band. It didn't matter whether you could actually play an instrument. Musicianship was not the point. The music was intentionally confrontational. So was the performance style. The angrier and more offensive, the better. Rock and roll had gotten too slick, overproduced, and there was a growing rebellion against its manufactured sound. Punk also became the antidote to the growing popularity of disco, which had taken hold all across America after the release of Saturday Night Fever. I didn't go to Studio 54 when it opened in 1977 and soon became the epicenter of Manhattan's chic uptown nightlife. Although I wish I had, just to say that I did. I liked pulsating dance music and the glamorous, decadent lifestyle on display. Maybe I was afraid I wouldn't make it past the velvet rope, lorded over by a 19-year-old dictator doorman. The downtown punk clubs were grungier, more egalitarian, and easier to get into. Okay, some punk music sucked, but there were legendary performances by Talking Heads, the Patti Smith Group, Blondie, Television, The Police, and the Ramones. I went to CBGB, Max's Kansas City, and the Mud Club, mostly to people watch. I was a natural voyeur, fascinated by the subversive subculture surrounding the punk scene. But whether you were a fan of the music, a fan of the attitude, a fan of the anarchy, or just a fan of the widely available cocaine, it was clear that something raw and rebellious was happening. I watched as it began to spread, taking field notes like a cultural anthropologist. There are some people who have a clear goal and a focused plan about how to achieve it. I had a general direction, but lacked a roadmap. My parents were helping with my rent, but I knew that wouldn't last for long. I had pushed their generosity to the limit and hated myself for it. I was no longer a student. I needed to find work. 9 to 5. Dolly Parton. Back in the late 70s, there wasn't much film work in New York City. I helped out on a few low-budget movies, but indie film jobs barely paid, if at all, so I enrolled with a Gal Friday temp agency and got some part-time office gigs. I did fine if they put me behind the reception desk or had me filing papers, but if the job required typing, I was a disaster. This was a time before word processing, when everyone used manual typewriters, whiteout, and carbon paper, so every time I made a mistake, I'd have to start from scratch. I'd crumple the messed-up letter into a ball and hide it in my handbag. By the time I left work, my bag was bulging. I got a job as a production assistant on a commercial that featured a famous basketball star, but I don't remember who it was. I had minimal interest in basketball or its players. This would come back to haunt me in 2012 when I found myself directing a women's basketball comedy, but more about that later. The job mostly involved sweeping the set in between takes and bringing people coffee. But I got to listen in as a group of advertising execs sat around a bank of video monitors critiquing the shot being filmed over and over and over. It was a close-up of the basketball player's feet stepping out of a limo wearing Converse All-Stars. The execs drove the director nuts with their notes. One said the shoelaces should hang more to the right. Another said more to the left. A third said the laces should be tucked inside the shoe. Too many cooks, too many opinions. It seemed like a very frustrating job that put me off ever wanting to direct a TV commercial. Missing the camaraderie of being around film students, I took a screenwriting class at the New School and wrote a film treatment with a classmate named Peter. It was based on the true story of a Vietnam vet who had committed a robbery and would be one of the first veterans officially diagnosed with PTSD, which was then used in his legal defense. My sister had recently started work as a public defender in Manhattan and was involved in the case. Taking our mother's advice, Denise had become a lawyer and moved to New York City. She put me in touch with the Vietnam vet. Peter and I optioned our treatment to a TV producer, so I made my second trip to LA and stayed at the Chateau Marmont. Back then, the chateau was shabby chic and relatively inexpensive. The only room service available was a turkey or cheese sandwich and beer. Our project never went beyond the treatment stage, and I realized that many projects get optioned, few get made. Over the next year, I made several more trips to LA, taking advantage of the generosity of my friend Linda and learning to like the undulations of her waterbed. I sat around her apartment complex swimming pool listening to other young hopefuls pitching projects as they sunbathed. I met with a few junior executives at production companies, but despite their casual friendliness, I felt like I was running in circles. I could knock on doors until my fists were bloody, but chances were slim to none I'd get a shot at directing a movie. Maybe if I was lucky, I'd find work as a gopher or an assistant to one of the D girls at a studio. Development girls, or D girls as they were called back then, were often attractive young female executives with no power. Thankfully, that pejorative term is no longer in use. The industry was filled with intelligent young women, former English majors from Ivy League universities, who were now reading scripts and writing coverage reports. But I was determined to be a director. I'd had a promising start. My short student films had won awards. I'd received prestigious filmmaking grants from the New York State Council on the Arts and the American Film Institute. I didn't want to be read scripts. I wanted to direct movies. The male directors who were getting attention, Spielberg, Coppola, Scorsese, De Palma, had started out directing low-budget films and B-movie horror flicks for renegade producers like Roger Corman. I respected that kind of independent spirit. That was the path I wanted to take, and if no one was going to hire me, I'd just have to hire myself. So, I returned to New York, determined to make a low-budget indie feature film that I would write, direct, produce, edit, and cater, just as I'd done at NYU. Somehow, I'd pull all the pieces together. Then, something unexpected happened that caught me off guard. I fell in love. Just the thing to distract me from my goal. What's love got to do with it? Tina Turner. Jan was a professor at NYU. Do you see a pattern here? Clearly, I had a thing for pedagogues. He taught economics and was a friend of a friend from film school. They had both emigrated from Poland to New York in the late 1960s. I met Jan at a New Year's Eve party held somewhere in New Jersey. We had arrived with other people. All I remember is that at midnight, after quite a few glasses of champagne and vishnuvka, sour cherries soaked in vodka, we found ourselves in the corner of the room, kissing. It turned out that Jan lived on 9th Street, not far from me. By now, I had moved into a new apartment, another tiny L-shaped studio in the same building. It was no bigger than the first, but at least my own name was on the lease, and I could list my name and address in the Manhattan phone directory. That made me feel like an official New Yorker. I bought a cheap pull-out sofa bed and furnished the studio with leftover stuff from my teenage bedroom, U-hauled up to New York. When the pull-out was open, there was no space to walk between the bed and the desk, so I had to crawl across the bed to reach the kitchen nook. But what made me feel most like a real New Yorker was that I hired a telephone answering service. The cassette message machine had not yet been invented, so anyone who wanted to receive phone messages hired a service where a live human actually answered your number. Then you'd call into the service to retrieve your messages. Most of the services hired out-of-work actors, which was pretty cool since they added in a touch of method acting as they recited your messages. Susan, your mother really wants you to call her back. She'll be up until midnight and needs to know if you received the book of 2-for-1 restaurant coupons she sent last week. Jan called the following day and asked me out for a drink, via phone message. I told him I was busy, via phone message. I wasn't, but remembered my mother's old-school advice to always play a little hard to get. It must have worked, because he asked me out for the next night, and the night after that. And then we saw each other almost every night for the next 3 years. Jan was cute, super smart, and just a little bit arrogant, which was part of his charm. He also had a voracious curiosity about all things cultural, academic, idiosyncratic, and a little bit naughty, along with a mischievous, dark sense of humor that came from growing up in a communist bloc country. I'd always had a thing for foreigners. I liked their otherness. And for an Eastern European, he had surprisingly good teeth. During the 1970s, sex was everywhere. The sexual revolution was in full swing. Birth control was readily available, and sex was presumed to be safe, fun, and guilt-free, even healthy. No one had a clue what dangers were lurking around the corner. In LA, it was the height of the porn industry. Hundreds and hundreds of porn films were being shot in the San Fernando Valley, which gave employment to many young filmmakers eager for any kind of work behind the camera. Francis Ford Coppola said he got his industry start on the set of a porn film. Others included Barry Sonnenfeld, Men in Black, then working as an up-and-coming cameraman, Abel Ferrara, Bad Lieutenant, and Wes Craven, A Nightmare on Elm Street, Scream. Craven's debut feature film had the provocative title 9 Lives of a Wet Pussy. Softcore porn was also a way for some now very famous actors, like Sylvester Stallone, to get their on-screen start. The porn wars of the 1980s would erupt a few years later, with the anti-porn feminists on one side of the battlefield and sex-positive feminists on the other. Some say this polarizing division marked the end of second-wave feminism, ushering in the third wave, the riot girl punk subculture feminism of the early 90s. We had read a New York Magazine article about a new club called Plato's Retreat. It was a swingers club that had opened in the Ansonia Hotel, in the space where the Continental Baths had once been. We were not swingers, but decided it was a cultural experience worth investigating. You could only enter Plato's Retreat as a straight couple or a single woman. Single women got a discounted rate, but groups of men alone were not allowed in. You were encouraged to leave your clothes in a changing area and handed a towel. Or you could choose to stay dressed and be a voyeur. I draped myself in a towel and remained wrapped the entire evening, as much out of vanity as modesty. The club was an exhibitionist's playground, with some guests parading brick-house bodies, others with saggy boobs and flabby bellies. There was a long buffet table that served crackers, fruit, carrot and celery sticks, juice and soft drinks. Alcohol was not available, but I'm sure many couples brought along a personal stash of Quaaludes. There was a dance floor where they played disco songs like The Hustle and a large room filled with thin mattresses where you could watch people having sex. Or join in if you could find a non-sticky spot on the mat. That alone was a turnoff. The club-goers were a mixed bag. A few curious celebrity types, some uptown Manhattanites looking for adventure, some polyester-clad bridge and tunnel swingers. These were reckless, Dionysian times. Post-Vietnam, pre-AIDS. Jan and I flitted around like flies on a wall, me in my towel and platform shoes, him in his topsiders, taking it all in. Many nights we would stay up late watching shows on Manhattan cable TV, which later became HBO. It was the very early days of cable, and there were public access programs that ranged from televangelists to Glenn O'Brien's TV Party, where Mr. O'Brien interviewed downtown celebs about all things cool and trendy. There was even a Wiccan chat show. But most popular were the naked talk shows. A chubby, bearded fellow named Daniel J. hosted a program where he interviewed adult entertainment stars, along with an assortment of naked guests who sat cross-legged, yoga-style, on the floor around him. Then there was the queen of public access, Robin Bird, a former porn star who hosted her own talk show in a crocheted bikini and ended each episode by dancing with her guests to a theme song she'd written called Baby Let Me Bang Your Box. And how can anyone forget the Ugly George Hour of Truth? Ugly George wore a silver lame singlet and carried a bulky 1970s video rig on his shoulder. He would follow women down deserted New York City streets and film his attempts to get them to undress in public. He He had a 50-50 success rate. I guess everyone wanted their 15 minutes of fame, even if that meant flashing their titties on a public access TV show, watched only by insomniacs. Jan was erudite. He introduced me to the New York Review of Books and authors like Milan Kundera, Italo Calvino, and Renata Adler. He bought me the diaries of Anais Nin, and we read them aloud in bed, smoking pot. We went to see experimental theater at La Mama. He introduced me to Dean and DeLuca when it was just a small specialty food shop on Prince Street. Joel Dean and Giorgio DeLuca were behind the cash register, and Soho was still a funky neighborhood filled with cheap artists' lofts and small factories making notions, buttons, snaps, fashion accessories, and underwear, bras, and panties. It's hard to imagine, but back in the early 1970s, Soho was scary at night. It didn't have an acronym until 1974. In the late 19th century, it was called Hell's 100 Acres. In the early 20th, it was simply called the area south of Houston Street. Once the sun went down, the streets were dark and deserted. There were a few blocks of 4-story tenement apartments on the west side, bordering Greenwich Village, where the Italian families lived. But much of Soho was made up of small factory buildings and workshops with cast-iron facades. Many were empty after the dry goods manufacturers moved out. These open workshops, with large windows and rickety wooden floors, were slowly being transformed into artists' lofts. But in the mid-70s, they housed an assortment of squatters, artists, and drifters who had managed to get to New York with nothing more than a backpack and the scribbled address of a place to crash passed on by a friend. I remember one gigantic loft sectioned off into a warren of tiny bedrooms, divided by opaque plastic shower curtains hanging from poles on the ceiling. Getting up to the 3rd or 4th floor involved knowing how to work a manual freight elevator that ran on a system of pulleys and chains. Or you could climb the treacherous, incredibly steep stairs that induced vertigo if you dared to look down. When I moved to Soho in 1983, the neighborhood had just started to gentrify. But that's still 4 years away, because right now it's 1979, and I'm about to move in with Jan. Don't Do Me Like That. Tom Petty and the Heartbreakers. I'd been seeing Jan for 3 years when we decided to live together. He had just gotten tenure at NYU, so he was eligible for faculty housing in a modern high-rise building designed by I.M. Pei near Houston Street. It was a subsidized 3-bedroom apartment for only $350 a month. There was a reproduction Picasso sculpture in the front courtyard, a dishwasher in the kitchen, and an underground garage down below. I gave up my tiny studio apartment, donated my childhood furniture to the Salvation Army, packed my books and clothes, and moved into the appropriately named Silver Towers. Little by little, I found myself immersed in Jan's academic lifestyle. Looking back on it now, I think it was a distraction from my own film career, which seemed to be on hold. It was like I was trying on another new identity to see if one day it might fit. At the time, I thought I was happy, but maybe you can be unhappy and not know it. And there was another thing. As modern as my mom was, in some ways she was still a traditional Jewish mother, although far from stereotypical. But she was truly happy being married. After marriage, she had come out of her shell, grown more confident and more adventurous. So she wanted everyone she loved to be married too, seeing it as a launching pad for future happiness. And in Huntington Valley, if you weren't married by 27, your shelf life was beginning to expire. Even my 25-year-old younger sister had recently gotten married. I was about to turn 28, so somehow the thought that since Jan and I were living together and his career was going well, maybe we should get married bubbled to the surface. But was marriage something you did with the best available person who sauntered into your life before your desirability expiration date? Unlike some of my high school friends, being married had not been my priority. I'd been focused on a career, making movies. But once the idea of marriage was out of the box, it lodged itself in my brain. I don't remember the exact sequence of events. There had been no wedding proposal, no ring, no declarations of eternal love, not even printed invitations. But the next thing I knew, my mother had planned an engagement party at her house with her friends. My mother loved organizing things. Even the smallest event was reason for celebration. I was reluctant to ask any of my NYU friends to travel to the Philadelphia suburbs. Maybe I was secretly embarrassed that I was turning into the person I had tried to escape. The engagement party was just me, Jan, my relatives, and a lot of my mother's friends. I'm sure we both felt disconnected from what was going on around us. Jan looked like a fish out of water. I opened our presents, oohed and awed, and passed them to Jan. He smiled, numbly. My aunts had pooled together to buy us sterling silverware, 8 six-piece place settings from Christofle. We were given crystal wine glasses, decanters, casserole dishes, and Danish modern plates. All the lovely things newlyweds might want to start a life together. But the atmosphere of the party was surreal. On the ride home from Philadelphia, I could tell Jan was edgy. I decided to ignore it, hoping it was just pre-marriage jitters. I should have seen it coming. As it happened, the following week we were invited to a cocktail event at the Afghan consulate in New York. One of Jan's colleagues, a professor from a prestigious family in Kabul, had organized the party to raise awareness about the recent Soviet invasion of Afghanistan that had taken place on December 24th. Several of Jan's NYU co-workers were there, as well as a pretty young woman who worked part-time as an assistant in the economics department. Someone I'd never met before. She'd come to the event alone, but was hanging around the group of NYU professors. She was hanging around Jan. After the party, a bunch of us decided to go to Hurrah, a dance club on West 62nd Street. The club was crowded, the music was thumping, and the dance floor was packed. I went to the bar to get a drink, and when I returned, Jan was gone. I looked around the room but couldn't find him. I made my way to the dance floor and scanned the crowd. There he was, in the middle of the room, dancing like a fool with the economics department assistant. And Jan never danced. As a filmmaker, I'm often in the position of being an observer, an outsider watching the action from behind the camera through a lens. So at first, I watched them smiling and dancing as if they were actors in a film. That was how I could separate myself from the shock. It would be a coping mechanism I'd use throughout my life. I replayed the dance floor scene in slow motion. I broke it into master shots and close-ups and over-the-shoulder shots. I tried to edit out the parts that were the most disturbing. I played the scene in fast-forward, in reverse, in black and white. But it was always the same scene, and the close-up of Jan's face revealed he was in love. Or was it just lust? No, it looked like love. I left Hurrah and took a taxi back to his, apartment in Silver Towers. It was now about 1 a.m. I sat at his, dining table in his, darkened living room, feeling dazed. Jan returned home about an hour later. I'm sure we had an argument that night, but I've edited that scene out of my memory. Maybe I was expecting him to come up with an excuse that would soften the blow. Even a fake, corny excuse would have sufficed. I'm sorry, I was drunk, I was stoned, I just wanted some exercise. But he offered no explanation. A few days later, Jan moved out and into the economics department assistant's apartment uptown near Columbia, where she was finishing her PhD in psychology. Oh, fuck. She was pretty and smart. I don't know if I was heartbroken because I'd lost Jan, or because I'd lost myself. I suddenly felt like I'd wandered down a wrong path and disappeared. I'd come to New York to be a somebody, not a somebody's wife. I was 28, without a purpose, without a partner, without self-esteem. I'd given up my apartment to move into a faux silver tower with a licensed faux Picasso sculpture out front. Being a tenured professor, Jan was entitled to live there. I was not. I would have to move out within a few months. I spent the month of January crying in the shower. At night, boo-hoo-hoo tears trickled down my cheeks as I lay alone in bed. I think part of me enjoyed playing the role of a jilted woman, like the ones I'd watched in those 1950s melodramas I loved, the parts played by my namesake, Susan Hayward. But I hid my feelings when Jan returned to the apartment on occasion to pick up some of his personal belongings, his books, his underwear, even his fucking walk. At times, my hurt turned to anger. Jan had replaced me with someone he thought more worthy of his affection, someone he thought was smarter or prettier, or who would have a more esteemed future. I needed to prove him wrong. So after I had cried myself dry, I turned my anger into resolve. I would muster up the same "I'll show you" attitude I felt when Bobby C. broke my heart in 8th grade, when Mrs. Kirschbaum put me in the dumb kids reading group, when my high school friends' parents said I was a bad influence on their daughters. I'll show you all. I believed that art had the power to heal. I still do. So I decided to pour all my hurt into my work instead. Maybe fate had intervened to shove me back on track. Life is funny like that. But first, what to do about all those engagement gifts? Some were still arriving in the mail. I imagined writing thank you notes to my relatives. Thank you for the lovely cast-iron cheese fondue set, but I will be returning it shortly, as I will not be making cheese fondue for my husband or children any time in the near future. Instead, I will be making a major motion picture. I never did return the Christophilus silver service for 8. I was going to, but my aunts had taken pity on their spinster niece and told me to hold on to it for next time, although dubious there would be a next time given my age. I also didn't return the casserole bowl, which proved to be a very pragmatic gift that I still use to this day. I look upon it as a souvenir of an alternate reality that might have been mine. Jan and I had goodbye sex when he came by to take his suits out of the closet. Goodbye sex is always good because it has hurt and guilt mixed in it, and we both knew this would be the last time we'd ever be physical together. I was not trying to win him back. He was not pretending he loved me. He had moved on to the woman who would become his wife. They would get married and have 2 children. She would become a psychotherapist and write some books. Within a few years, they would break up, and she would change her ordinary first name to the more uncommon name of a Western state. I guess she too wanted to reinvent herself. They would go through an acrimonious divorce, and his kids would not speak to him for several decades. It's funny how life is full of synchronicities. Around the time Jan and I split up, my grandmother, Nanny S., passed away. In her will, she left me money intended for my upcoming wedding. Since there was not going to be a wedding, I suddenly found myself with $12,000. Perhaps not a fortune, but in 1979, it was enough to jumpstart the indie film I had put off making. I'd lost a fiancé and a 3-bedroom apartment with a dishwasher and an underground parking spot, but I was now determined to make a movie. I had no excuse to delay. I just needed to figure out what I wanted to say and how I wanted to say it. Walk on the Wild Side, Lou Reed. Being alone with no romantic attachment and only temp work, I had a lot of time to wander the city. I wanted to keep busy. And as my gloom began to lift, a sense of freedom crept in. I'm sure the feeling was forced at first, but gradually, it took hold for real. I was trying to get back in touch with the creative force that had drawn me to the city in the first place. In 1980, New York City was still struggling with rising crime and decreased social services, but in the East Village, no-wave, cheap guerrilla-style filmmaking was flourishing as the worlds of punk, rap, poetry, and graffiti art cross-pollinated. Inspired in part by the French Nouvelle Vague cinema of the 1960s, specifically the work of Jean-Luc Godard, every New York indie filmmaker's hero, filmmakers like Jim Jarmusch, Amos Poe, Eric Mitchell, Michael Oblowitz, and later Scott B., Beth B., Sarah Driver, Tom DeCillo, Bette Gordon, and Lizzie Borden were making personal, disruptive, and raw movies without money, without permits, without professional actors, without formal scripts, and in some cases, without any script at all. I started going out more often to clubs and performance spaces. New spots like the Pyramid Club on Avenue A were popping up, with drag performances that brought together punk, queer, and straight clubgoers. Traditional boundaries were being blurred. There was a reckless energy you could feel in the air, a sense that anything was possible. If you could think it, you could be it. And the more I explored, the more my antenna went up as I searched out, or stumbled upon, unexpected facets of life in the city. For years, I'd taken notes about people I'd encountered who possessed some distinctive quality, some personal quirk that grabbed my attention. I was curious about human nature and carried a little notebook to write down observations, ideas for movie scenes, fragments of dialogue overheard in a bar or on the subway. I made sketches of what people were wearing. I doodled on napkins, matchbook covers, wrote words on my arms, whatever surface was available. Then I stashed my scribblings in a desk drawer, waiting for the right time to make sense of it all. I'd heard about a mysterious place called the Hellfire Club in the basement of a funky building in the meatpacking district. 30 years later, the club would become an expensive Mexican restaurant and tourist brunch spot. It was a cavernous space with black walls, a long bar, and an edgy vibe. It seemed like a dark place I should steer clear of, which is probably why I was curious to go. I was hungry for new experiences and felt the urge to walk a little closer to the edge, but without falling off. The club had a decadent BDSM following, a subterranean world of misfits and curiosity seekers. It was how I'd imagine a club in 1920s Berlin might be. The Velvet Underground's music played over the sound system. It smelled dank like a gym locker. I didn't go there looking for romance or even temporary companionship. I was looking for a story. There were several small rooms off of the main room. In one, you could watch a guy lying in a cast-iron bathtub being urinated on by whoever walked by and wanted to take a piss. There were men in studded black leather strappy things, tied up and being spanked by dominatrices in black leather corsets. I walked past people in harnesses and chains, trying not to gawk. It was like an X-rated interactive museum exhibit with an assortment of deviant sexual activity on display. But after a while, I started to feel uncomfortable, so I went to the bar to get a drink before going home. Standing there was a guy wearing Buddy Holly glasses who looked like a middle-aged accountant. While I was trying to get the bartender's attention, we struck up a conversation. The music was loud, so to be heard, he needed to stand very close and talk directly into my ear. What made this strange was that the man was totally naked except for a pair of black socks and tasseled loafers. I wasn't sure where to look, so we chatted for a few minutes while I finished my drink, then left. I later thought about how comfortable, how at ease this naked man in black socks seemed in this very strange place, casually sipping his drink. I wondered what it must be like to be him. And I realized that everyone is seeking a place where they can feel at home. This scene wouldn't make it into the screenplay that was now percolating in my head. But I knew my film would be about someone searching for a place to fit in. I was inching closer to the story I wanted to tell.